So a long-standing bit of fodder for conspiracy theorists of the American persuasion includes various imagery found on the United States $1 bill, with the most infamous of graphics on said nefarious item being the so-called all-seeing eye, more properly titled the Eye of Providence. To add some wood to the fire, it turns out that the Eye of Providence is used by none other than everyone's second favorite source of conspiracy theories, the Freemasons. So what's up with such a blatant use of this secret society symbol on the dollar bill? Well, it turns out, while many point to the Freemasons and Illuminati as the source of this particular symbol, there is another organization behind it, one that has for centuries worked tirelessly to bend governments the world over to their will. We are, of course, now talking about Christianity. While many a conspiracy theorist today will say the Eye of Providence represents Satan, in truth, it has represented God watching over humanity for at least half a millennia or so. Beyond God's eye, the commonly added triangle around the eye represents the Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. As for the sun rays, also commonly shown around the eye, this is meant to represent God's divinity. You can see a prime historic example of this in Jacopo Pontormo's 1525 painting, Supper of Emmaus, as well as on many historic church buildings, stained glass windows, and things like that. So how did this Christian symbol end up on the dollar bill? When the Continental Congress kicked King George III to the curb, they needed an official seal for the new nation. Towards this end, they tasked Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams with creating one. These three titans of American history in turn enlisted the aid of an artist named Pierre-Eugène de Cimetière to help out. As for Franklin, he pushed for a seal that, in his own words, depicted Moses standing on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who is sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand, raised from a pillar of fire in the clouds, reaching to Moses to express that he acts by command of the deity. The motto he wanted on the seal was "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," a motto Jefferson would eventually use on his own personal seal. Speaking of Jefferson, he also wanted to go with biblical imagery, in this case wanting a depiction of the Israelites wandering through the wilderness with a cloud and a pillar of fire guiding them. An interesting choice for a man who once wrote his own version of the Bible that got rid of all the supernatural elements, among other parts that he didn't agree with. Moving on to Adams, he wanted the Choice of Hercules painting used for the seal. In it, Hercules is flanked by two women representing virtue and vice, two paths he could choose. One of the paths was for his own pleasure and a life of ease. On the other side was a life of hardship, but glory. Finally, de Cimetière suggested a shield with the initials of the 13 states on it. Flanking the shield was a female representation of liberty holding an anchor and a spear. On the other side stood a man holding a rifle and a tomahawk. Above all is the Eye of Providence in a triangle with sun rays shining down, indicating God being on the side of the new nation. De Cimetière also went with E pluribus unum, out of many, one, for the motto. This slogan was borrowed from the Gentleman's Magazine, which used it to represent many articles collected from various outlets and put into one magazine. When these ideas were presented to Congress on August 20th, 1776, they weren't big fans of any of them, though made some suggestions of modifications to de Cimetière's and to potentially go forward with that one. However, rather than send it back for reworking after these suggestions were made, they just tabled the matter. About 4 years later, in March of 1780, Congress once again figured that it was time to get someone to work on an official seal, and this time tasked a slightly less prestigious group with the job. That was James Lovell, John Morris Scott, and William Churchill Houston. Like their predecessors, this group brought in outside help in one Francis Hopkinson, perhaps better remembered today for designing the first official United States flag. Hopkinson went ahead and adapted the shield concept, but modified it just to show 13 stripes. Most notably to the progression of the seal, he also included an olive branch, an arrow held by an Indian man, 13 stars, and included a slogan of Bello vel pace paratus, meaning prepared in war or peace. Finally, he included the date of 1776 in Roman numerals. Beyond this version, he also came up with a second one, but both were eventually rejected and the matter once again tabled. While you might think the third time would be a charm, not so much. About 2 years later, in May of 1782, Congress tasked John Rutledge Elias Boudinot, who would later be replaced with Arthur Lee, and Arthur Middleton with creating the seal. Yet again, the trio brought on board someone else to do the actual work, in this case a lawyer by the name of William Barton. Most pertinent to the progression here, his design included, among other things, an eagle and, on the reverse, a pyramid with the Eye of Providence above it, though without the triangle that had been present in the first committee's version. Although, funnily enough, he originally thought to put a palm tree on top of the pyramids, as he observed that, when cut down, palm trees generally grow again from the same roots just as strong as ever. After he wisely switched to the more broadly appealing Eye of Providence, he went with the slogan Deo Favente, with God favoring. Congress, as ever, observed the results of the committee's work and responded with another big old meh. Apparently not content to wait around for too long this time, almost directly after, on June 13, 1782, they gave Secretary of Congress Charles Thomson the task of creating the seal. Rather than giving the job to someone else, he just did it himself. Borrowing something from all of the previous designs, what he came up with was eventually as follows. Besides the shield with stripes representing the states, he depicted a bald eagle holding an olive branch and one talon representing peace. In the other talon, the eagle is holding 13 arrows, one for each of the original 13 states, with the arrows representing the United States' readiness to fight to protect its interests. However, the eagle's head is turned toward the olive branch, symbolic of the nation preferring peaceful relations. Further, representing the 13 original states are 13 stars over the eagle's head. The final motto chosen was the aforementioned and fitting E Pluribus Unum. On the reverse side of the seal is Barton's unfinished pyramid, with said pyramid representing, as Thomson himself notes, strength and duration. The 13 layers represent the 13 states which comprise the nation. The Eye of Providence at the top, as mentioned, represents God watching over the nation. The text Annuit Coptis is also included, roughly meaning He, God, has favored our undertaking. On the bottom is the text Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning roughly a new order of the ages, inspired from a line in Virgil's Eclogue 4. Also included at the base of the pyramid are the Roman numerals for the year of the establishment of that new order, 1776. And so it was that on June 20th, 1782, Congress approved Thomson's design based on the description alone, as at this point Thomson hadn't actually drawn it up yet, simply giving descriptive notes and the thought process behind each element. Of course, for those who don't want to trust the guy who designed it, an alternate hypothesis as to the origin and symbols used here is succinctly outlined in an article titled Satan on the United States Dollar. First of all, I will interpret the Latin words on the seal Annuit Coptis, meaning announcing the birth of, and Novus Ordo Seclorum means New World Order. So therefore, it says announcing the birth of the New World Order. The date in Roman numerals is 1776, the year the modern Illuminati was formed, and also the year of American independence. The Latin E Pluribus Unum means one out of many. That is, order out of chaos, which is the foundation of the New World Order's plan to unify the world's governments, religions, and money systems into one, so the world can be controlled. Why the Antichrist must come soon. The capstone has not come down on the pyramids. This means that the plan is not complete. Only when the New World Order is established upon all nations and the world leader is enthroned, the plan will be complete. On that note, for those who think the Illuminati or Freemasons are behind the symbols, the good news for conspiracy theorists is it turns out that they're absolutely true. Oh, that's weird.
On that note, for those who think the Illuminati or Freemasons are behind the symbols, while the Illuminati were technically created in May of 1776, this organization was not founded in America, but rather Bavaria. Further, funny enough, given the way they are depicted in Hollywood and books today, they were founded not as a mystic, shadowy organization, but on principles in opposition to superstitions, obscurantism, essentially withholding or obscuring knowledge from the general public, and against abuses of state power, particularly the abuses of religious groups who were so heavily influencing said governments toward their own ends at the time. Thus, the original Illuminati would have been greatly opposed to the Illuminati generally depicted in fiction today. The Illuminati, however, didn't ever gain much traction, nor did it last long, as the Duke of Bavaria, Charles Theodore, with the support of the Catholic Church, saw to it that such societies as the Illuminati and the Freemasons were outlawed and persecuted in the region. Thus, given its location and relatively small size and influence, it would be quite a stretch to think they somehow influenced the Eye of Providence and pyramid being put on the United States seal when it was. Further, as noted, contrary to what is often put forth, this new order and the date of 1776 couldn't be more explicit that it represents the new United States government, literally placed at the base of the pyramid built of the 13 states, with God watching over and approving of them all. As to the Freemasons, the only member of that organization who had anything at all to do with the creation of the seal was Ben Franklin, but his proposal was for the aforementioned Moses imagery, not a pyramid with the Eye of Providence. His slogan was also quite different than the whole New Order one that would eventually be chosen. It's also noteworthy that at the time the United States seal was created, it wasn't a symbol of the Freemasons. They didn't adopt the Eye of Providence until 1797. On top of that, the Freemason version uses a cloud above the eye instead of a triangle around it. This was another relatively common version in Christianity going back to at least the 17th century. It's not really clear why the Freemasons chose this version once they did adopt the symbol. And on top of all of this, the original creation of this imagery for the US seal only came about after not one, not two, but three rejected designs over the span of several years made by three separate committees, with nobody in Congress liking what they came up with. Thus, if a shadowy group running the world's governments was really behind it all, they showed some pretty poor organizational skills in their attempt to try to reveal themselves on the United States seal for, I don't know, reasons, we guess? So that's where the seal came from and the actual meaning behind it. How did it get on the dollar bill, though? This wouldn't happen until about a century and a half after the creation of the seal, though funny enough did have to do with a couple of Freemasons. To begin with, the US didn't really bother with paper money for a long while into its history, with the exception of Continental Congress trying to raise some funds by issuing continental currency in 1775. However, there was an inherent flaw in the way this paper money system was enacted, at least according to Ben Franklin. Instead of backing the money with land assets, as Franklin had suggested, they were backed by rarely collected taxes by the states themselves, as the Continental Congress couldn't itself collect taxes at the time, the whole government body collecting taxes for its populace being a bit of a sore spot for the then rebel group. This, combined with the fact that the notes were easily counterfeited, saw them become mostly worthless, and thus the young nation abandoned an official paper money currency, though this didn't stop many banks in the US from issuing their own paper money to fill in the gap in the market beyond coins. It wouldn't be until 1861 that the US government itself would put into general circulation its own paper money again in the form of demand notes, nicknamed greenbacks. This finally brings us to the creation of the $1 bill. First issued in 1862, unlike the dollar bill of modern times, this did not sport the Eye of Providence, nor even George Washington. Rather, it showed a guy by the name of Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, who apparently saw his chance for history to remember him, and he took it. What followed from here were several iterations of the dollar bill, starting with a rather prominent change in 1869, now showing George Washington, with the switch partially spurred by the fact that Congress decided to pass a bill that prohibited living people from appearing in various items, including currency notes. Later in 1886, Martha Washington would also grace the face of the $1 bill for a bit. Fast forwarding about a half century, a slew of changes to the dollar bill over the course of a decade or so ultimately saw the Eye of Providence added in 1935. The idea behind this particular change, one of the last to the dollar bill, came from the Secretary of Agriculture and future Vice President Henry Wallace. The inspiration here for Wallace came from reading a copy of the 1909 work by Gellert Hunt, which gave a detailed account of the genesis of the United States seal. Most pertinent to the topic at hand is that it included image copies of not just the front of the seal, which many people were familiar with, but the reverse with the pyramid. At the time, this was largely unknown and unused. In fact, Wallace himself, while he was a Freemason, so familiar with the Eye of Providence from that, as well as its prominence in Christianity, himself had never seen the reverse of the United States seal before. Not just liking the imagery, Wallace also noted that the Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages motto of the American government, could be tied into Roosevelt's own New Deal, hence the New Deal for the ages. Thus, Wallace suggested Roosevelt have the reverse side of the US seal put on a coin. Roosevelt loved the idea, but decided to put it on the dollar bill instead. However, before going through with it, he first ran the idea by his cabinet, among other potential objections, wondering if any religious group would be offended by putting a Christian symbol on the dollar, or conversely, if any Christian group might see it as him trying to put a version of a Freemason symbol there. In the end, after going around the room to ask various religious members of the cabinet their opinions, including devout Irish Catholic and Postmaster General James Farley, it was decided that it was likely various Christian groups would react positively to use of their symbol, and the whole Freemason connection wouldn't be an issue, particularly as it was really just using the reverse of the official US seal, not something Roosevelt himself came up with. Thus, the idea was pushed forward. Since the addition of the US seal imagery in 1935, the dollar bill has changed little other than "In God We Trust" added in 1957 to further double down on the whole religious theme, among a few other minor modifications. Now, how about a bonus fact? Speaking of continental currency, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the 1776 third of a dollar. The note depicts a sundial with the sun shining on it. Also included are the English words, mind your business, as well as the Latin word fugio, meaning I flee. This was designed by none other than Ben Franklin, who loved to embed subtle satire or humor into just about everything he was involved in, which has been speculated to be why he was not given the task of being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, instead just an advisor to the much less talented and less distinguished writer Thomas Jefferson. Whatever the case, in this case, Franklin was going for a picture and a word puzzle on the paper bill, which essentially sums up as I, time and money, flies, so mind your business. This design later gave rise to the Fugio cent, also designed by Ben Franklin, minted in 1787 with more or less the same thing depicted.
Alright, so contrary to popular belief, a decent percentage of the human population has known definitively the Earth was roughly spherical for over 2,000 years. This is hardly impressive, as we noted in our Brain Food Show podcast, which you should also check out. Bees also use this fact in their own absurdly fascinating navigation and in communicating directions to other bees. As for humans, we took a little longer to realize this, with Pythagoras from the 6th century BC generally credited with being the first known person to have suggested a spherical Earth, though the idea didn't exactly catch on at that point. Aristotle, 4th century BC, agreed and supported the hypothesis with observations such as that the southern constellations rise higher in the sky when a person travels south. He also noted that during a lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow is round. Much more definitively, the 3rd century BC head librarian of the Library of Alexandria, Eratosthenes, built on their ideas and managed to calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. How? Well, he simply used the knowledge that at noon on the summer solstice there was a well in Syene where the sun shone directly down to the bottom with no shadow. Thus, at noon on summer solstice, he used a rod to measure the angle of the shadow made in Alexandria and found it to be about 7 degrees, or about 1/50th of a circle. With this information, he now just needed to know the exact distance between Syene and Alexandria to get the circumference of the Earth, about 50 times the distance between Syene and Alexandria. He hired a survey crew, known as Bemetists, to measure the distance, which they found to be about 5,000 stadia. He then concluded that the Earth must be about 250,000 stadia around. Depending on which stadion measurement he was using, his figure was either 1% too small or 16% too large. Many scholars think it likely he was using the Egyptian stadion, 157.5 meters, being in Egypt at the time, which would make his estimate roughly 1% too small. Alright, so moving on to the so-called Dark Ages, in which Christianity supposedly squashed such outlandish ideas as a spherical Earth, the truth is exactly the opposite. In Christian medieval Europe, 7th century Catholic monk and scholar Bede produced an influential treatise that included a discussion of the spherical nature of the world. This work, The Reckoning of Time, was copied and distributed to clerics across the Carolingian Empire. Later, in the 1300s, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy also describes the Earth as a sphere, and again, nobody seemed to have a problem with this. The Catholics, and later other branches of Christianity, weren't the only religious sects that seemed to have its clergy and scholars almost universally think that the world was spherical. The Islamic world also concurred, as historian Jeffrey Burton Russell sums up, with extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the Earth was flat. Beyond the academics of the Western world, even the most empty-headed sailor knew the Earth was spherical simply by the fact that ships disappear over the horizon with the bottom first, and then the mast the last to be sighted. A similar effect is observed when spotting land from a ship. It really doesn't take a rocket surgeon to realize that the sea's surface must curve continually. Despite this, there really still is a tiny percentage of the world's population who believe that the world is flat. You might at this point be wondering just how many. While internet comment threads make it seem as if the percentage is large, the reality is probably drastically less. I mean, comment trolls are going to troll. Look below for examples. As for some numbers, according to a 2018 poll run by the massive market research firm YouGov, the 8,215 responses, which were chosen to have a high probability of accurately representing the wider adult populace, showed 84% of respondents said they have always believed the world is round. 5% stated, I always thought the world is round, but more recently I am skeptical / have doubts. 2% stated, I have always thought the world is flat, but more recently I am skeptical/have doubts. And 2% went with, I have always believed the world is flat. The remaining 7% stated other or not sure. While the good people at YouGov certainly know their stuff with respect to getting accurate data that represents the wider populace, we were curious as to what a larger sample of our own audience would reveal, though with the caveat that a general internet poll can sometimes be notoriously inaccurate. But for the curious, and for whatever it's worth, our poll asking more or less the same questions received over 72,000 votes. So, what were the results? Well, approximately here we go. 96% of respondents stated that they firmly believe the world is round. 1% went with, I used to firmly believe the world is round, but now have doubts. 1% voted for, I firmly believe the world is flat. 0% stated, I used to firmly believe the world is flat, but now I have doubts. 1% noted, I am not sure what I believe on this issue. These numbers seem surprisingly reasonable for an online poll when comparing to something a little more rigorously implemented like the YouGov poll. While our numbers skew more towards round earthers, this is perhaps to be expected given we know definitively that our audience skews towards being much more educated than the general populace. Good for you guys. And just because we were curious about the many online trolls who, as stated, it's our pet hypothesis, are actually making it seem like there are a lot more flat earthers than there actually are, we did a follow-up poll which got 54,000 votes. For whatever it's worth, in this one, approximately 9% of respondents stated, I believe the world is round, but sometimes say online it's flat. 2% stated, I believe the world is flat, and advocate this position online. The remaining 89% stated, neither applies to me. And yes, we know these numbers don't add up to exactly 100% in either case, but YouTube's polling system rounds to the nearest whole number, so well, here we are. Okay, so with those numbers out of the way, this finally brings us to who started the relatively modern flat earth movement and how on God's oblate spheroid earth this movement is actually growing in an era where nearly all human knowledge is almost literally at everyone's fingertips. The genesis of the modern flat earth society started in the mid-19th century thanks to one Samuel Rowbotham of London, England. Dropping out of school at the tender age of 9, Rowbotham would eventually become convinced, or at least claimed he was, that not only was the Earth flat, but that everything we see in the heavens is actually only a few thousand miles from the Earth, stars and all. While his ideas were absurd for an incredible number of reasons, even given the technology and scientific knowledge of his era, what Rowbotham had going for him was that he was reportedly incredibly quick on his feet in debates and an extremely charismatic speaker, able to twist the words of even the best academics. It didn't actually matter if he was right or not, only that he was better at convincing lay people than the academics he regularly debated, or at least good at creating reasonable doubt. As noted by a contemporary article published in the Leeds Times, one thing he did demonstrate was that scientific dabblers unused to platform advocacy are unable to cope with a man, a charlatan, if you will, but clever and thoroughly up in his theory, thoroughly alive to the weakness of his opponents. As well as making a small fortune from public speaking, he also wrote various works, including a book aptly titled Earth, Not a Globe. Rowbotham ultimately created the Satanic Society, which, besides advocating for a flat Earth, also advocated that only facts that one could prove true themselves could be accepted as true. On the side, Rowbotham made a bit of extra money by going as Dr. Samuel Burley and making money by selling cure-alls and life extenders of his own invention. While by the early 20th century, the society he started had gradually faded into even more obscurity than it already was at its peak during Rowbotham's lifetime, all was not lost. The truth, it cannot be killed so easily, apparently. In 1956, when mankind was on the verge of putting a satellite in orbit, Samuel Shenton of Dover in the UK came across the former works of the Universal Satanic Society, the successor to Rowbotham's, and he was hooked. He then established the International Flat Earth Research Society, or IFERS. This adopted some of the ideas of the Satanic Society before it, most notably, as you might have guessed from their new name, that the Earth was flat. Of course, this timing wasn't exactly ideal given the launch of Sputnik in 1957, which, beyond being in orbit, put out a signal that anyone with a little know-how could track, very clearly demonstrating the spherical nature of the Earth. This didn't faze him in the slightest, however. He simply noted that satellites circled over the disk of the world, and that would sailing round the Isle of Wight prove that it was spherical. It is just the same for those satellites. When pictures of the Earth were taken from space, clearly showing the planet's spherical nature, the man who strongly advocated trusting what you can see with your own eyes stated, "It's easy to see how a photograph like that could fool the untrained eye." When astronauts came back still believing the Earth wasn't flat, he went with the catch-all explanation for any conspiracy theory when no other suitable explanation can be thought up. He stated, "It's a deception of the public, and it isn't right." Despite the giant, roughly spherical mound of evidence staring the members right in the face, including the variety easily confirmed by anyone with a modicum of knowledge in physics, the society did not die completely, though by 1972 had dropped from a peak of about 3,000 members down to around 100 spanning the globe. That same year, Shenton died, and Californian Charles Johnson more or less took over the remnants, creating the International Flat Earth Research Society of America. Johnson also advocated that there was a global conspiracy with regards to the very flat Earth, not just today, but spanning millennia. To quote him, this was a conspiracy that Moses, Columbus, and FDR all fought against. Beyond that, Columbus most definitely thought the Earth was spherical, simply misjudging its circumference. And we're guessing Moses didn't have to fight anyone on this one, as the ancient Egyptians firmly believed in the concept of a flat Earth, as did seemingly the Hebrews around the time he supposedly lived. So what exactly do the world's governments and countless scientists and high school physics students throughout human history have to gain by convincing people the world is spherical instead of flat? Well, Johnson advocated that this is a tool used by scientists to get rid of religion. Of course, as noted, Christian scholars throughout history, on the whole, have advocated for the very spherical Earth, and we're not aware of any major religious denomination the world over today that goes with the flat Earth model. So apparently there is no conflict. But hey, we guess Aristotle must have really had it in for those ancient Egyptian and Greek gods. In any event, despite Johnson's less than compelling arguments, over time this new society actually gained followers up to a peak of about 3,500 members under his leadership. Disaster struck, however, when a fire at headquarters destroyed some of the records of membership in 1997. Ultimately, Johnson himself passed away in 2001, and the society was temporarily just as dead. All was not lost, however, as there is no medium greater than the internet at giving humans the ability to discover the truth in anything for themselves, if we weren't all lazy and our monkey brains were not chock full of cognitive biases. And so it was that in 2004, one Daniel Shenton created a discussion forum home for the mostly dead Flat Earth Society, and by 2009, a new wiki website was created in its place, with the society slowly growing from there to apparently around 500 members to date. There are also many Flat Earth pages and channels on sites like Facebook, Twitter, and indeed YouTube that sometimes exceed 100,000 members or subscribers of a given page, channel, or profile, for whatever that's worth. In the latest incarnation of the society, as with their forebears, the modern group strongly advocates for only accepting that which you can see with your own eyes and prove with your own efforts. As they note on their website, the simplest is by relying on one's own senses to discern the true nature of the world around us. The world looks flat, the bottom of clouds are flat, the movement of the sun. These are all examples of your senses telling you that we do not live in a spherical, heliocentric world. This is what's called using an empirical approach, or an approach that relies on information from your senses. Alternatively, when using Descartes' method of Cartesian doubt to skeptically view the world around us, one quickly finds that the notion of a spherical world is the theory which has the burden of proof and not flat Earth theory. As for the model of the Earth they go with, while there is some dissension among the ranks over exact details, the current belief advocated by the Flat Earth Society is that the Earth is disc-shaped. The North Pole lies at the center of this disc, and there is an ice wall surrounding the outermost parts of the Earth that keep the oceans contained. This wall is nearly impossible to reach owing to the fact that NASA is closely guarding it, ensuring that no one ever gets close enough to see it for themselves. NASA also is extremely active in generating satellite photos of the Earth and generating other data, all meant to keep people believing in a spherical Earth. Seemingly, the Google Earth team must also be in on it too, clearly abandoning the company's long-held unofficial mantra of "don't be evil." As evidence of this conspiracy and how far-reaching it is, they also point out on their website that the United Nations emblem strongly resembles the Flat Earth Society's view of what the Earth actually looks like. We guess clearly showing the logo design team, led by industrial designer Oliver Lincoln Lundquist in 1945, didn't get the memo that the true shape of the Earth was supposed to be a secret. To be fair, when his team originally designed it, it was originally just supposed to be used on the badges at the United Nations Charter Signing Conference, so only for people who already knew that the Earth was flat. Fun fact though, Lundquist did, however, make up for the scrub later by designing the classic blue and white Q-tip box. In any event, you might at this point be wondering how the Flat Earth Society believes commercial airlines and ships the world over continue to seemingly travel in one direction and manage to circle the globe. Well, this is because these ships and planes are literally circling. They state, circumnavigation is performed by moving in a great circle around the North Pole. As for how the ship and plane captains don't seem to be aware of this, in modern times it's because GPS devices and autopilots are designed so the software makes it look like the craft is circling a globe and not continually turning slightly. Of course, it's not clear how they account for people tricking themselves when navigating before or without GPS, which has only been ubiquitous for a couple of decades or so. You can see our video, Who Invented GPS and How Does It Work, for more on that. This is a particularly important consideration in planes, where weight and balance is always an essential consideration if one doesn't want to die a fiery death. Thus, if they were really traveling in the way that flat earthers claim, the fuel requirements would be different, sometimes vastly so. No surprise here, big oil must of course be involved in covering that one up. As for, the whole day and night thing, this is explained on their website as such. The sun moves in circles around the North Pole. When it is over your head, it's day. When it's not, it's night. The light of the sun is confined to a limited area, and its light acts as a spotlight upon the Earth. The apparent effect of the sun rising and setting is a perspective effect. How exactly the light from the sun only works as a spotlight isn't clear. It's also not clear how the phases of the moon and lunar and solar eclipses work, given this spotlight model, and given they believe the sun is always above the Earth. Moving on, as for the many who claim to be able to see the curvature of the Earth when on high-altitude commercial flights, well, the Flat Earth Society, who advocated trusting your own senses over what anyone tells you, tells these people to, quote, "Quite simply, you cannot. The windows on commercial aircraft are small and heavily curved. Even if they flew high enough for a person to see curvature, it would still not be visible to passengers." As for the issue of someone with even a halfway decent telescope being able to see the spherical nature of other planets in the solar system, including them spinning away, the Flat Earth Society claims, planets are orbiting astronomical objects. The Earth is not a planet by definition, as it sits at the center of our solar system above which the planets and the sun revolve. The Earth's uniqueness, fundamental differences, and centrality makes any comparison to other nearby celestial bodies insufficient, like comparing basketballs to the court on which they bounce. As for how gravity works in the flat Earth model, the Earth is constantly accelerating at a rate of 32 feet per second squared, or 9.8 meters per second squared. This constant acceleration causes what you think of as gravity. Imagine sitting in a car that never stops speeding up. You will be forever pushed into your seat. The Earth works much the same way. It is constantly accelerating upwards, being pushed by a universal accelerator, a UA, known as dark energy or etheric wind. You may have spotted a problem with this explanation, given the whole issue of eventually exceeding the speed of light. In fact, if constant acceleration at 9.8 meters per second squared happens, it would only take about a year for the Earth to reach the speed of light. Well, they've got that covered too, explaining, due to special relativity, this is not the case. At this point, many readers will question the validity of any answer which uses advanced, intimidating-sounding physics terms to explain a position. However, it is true, the relevance equation is V over C equals tan h AT over C. One will find that in this equation, tan h AT over C can never exceed or equal 1. This means that velocity can never reach the speed of light, regardless of how long one accelerates for and the rate of the acceleration. Anyway, as to what lies below the Earth, this is heavily disputed among flat earthers, but it doesn't really matter as you can't get there anyway. You see, to quote flat earther Robbie Davidson in an interview with Forbes, "We don't believe anything can fall off the edge because a big portion of the flat Earth community believes that we're in a dome, like a snow globe, so the sun, moon, and stars are all inside. It's just very high, but all contained inside. So there's actually no way to fall off of the Earth." Given it takes only a modicum of effort to disprove pretty much everything said on their website and prove definitively for oneself that the Earth is roughly spherical without needing to trust any scientists or government, you might think that flat earthers just aren't trying. Well, you're kind of right, but there are exceptions. Case in point, limo driver Mike Hughes, who managed to raise about $8,000 thanks to a flat Earth fundraiser. Why? Well, it's to build a rocket to reach the heavens to once and for all prove that the Earth was flat. Reportedly, the final hilariously fitting steam-powered rocket and launch platform cost around $20,000 and took 10 years to build. With it, Hughes managed to achieve an altitude of almost 1,900 feet, which, while kind of impressive for an amateur-built homemade rocket that could carry a human, was nonetheless not able to achieve his objective of getting him to space. It's not even close. If only it was possible to build more powerful rockets, or if there existed a balloon designed to be able to soar into the heavens with some sort of device on board that could capture and store what it sees, like an eye. Or, stick with us here, people, if a human going along for the ride was a requirement to show NASA hadn't tampered with this futuristic visual capture device, some sort of bird-like machine that could carry humans above 1,500 feet. On that note, for a mere $12,000 to $16,000, Hughes could have purchased a charter flight ticket to not only take him higher than altitudes of 1,900 feet, but also take him to Antarctica to see the massive ice wall for himself. Or if the Flat Earth Society wanted to pool together their resources for prices of about $25,000 to $70,000, they could charter a flight to the South Pole itself. Though a thing they don't tell you on the vacation package brochure is that while you can go visit the South Pole, NASA subjects everyone that does to severe mental retraining to ensure all memories of the ice wall have been erased and replaced with pleasant but very wall-free recollections. All joking and head-scratching aside, it's always important to note that many of the core psychological quirks that see flat earthers intractably convinced that the Earth is flat in the face of all the evidence to the contrary exist in all of us. Monkey brain is going to monkey brain. We further all have many beliefs we firmly cling to, just as tenuously supported by our level of knowledge on a subject, though thankfully for most of us the absurdity isn't quite so easy to spot, allowing us to safely continue to think of ourselves as superior to mere mortals with alternate ideas. In the end, we all firmly believe many things that aren't true at all, and no amount of evidence could ever convince any of us to change our minds on some of these things. Food for thought indeed. In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Johnny asks us, who first came up with the little green men stereotype for aliens? Flying saucers, little green men, and anal probes have been a staple of our perception of aliens for as long as most of us have been alive. The reasoning behind the latter is obvious. Human scientists also can and do learn a lot about an animal by their feces. But where did the idea of short grey or green aliens actually come from in the first place? As to little green men, the concept of green beings has been around for centuries, from goblins to perhaps one of the most famous cases, the Green Children of Woolpit. For those not familiar, these were two children that seemed to have lived during the 12th century in England. When they were discovered in the fields, the little boy and the girl had green-tinged skin, they wore strange clothes, spoke an unfamiliar language, and both refused to eat regular food for some time, apparently being unfamiliar with it. If you're interested in who they were, why their skin was green, and where they came from, do check out our video on the subject, which is linked to below. Fast forwarding to the 19th century, we have the first known instance of the term little green men being used to describe aliens, found in The Green Boy from Hurrah, published in the Atlanta Constitution in 1899. In the story, it describes a short, green-skinned alien from, you guessed it, the planet Hurrah. Much more famously, Edgar Rice Burroughs' early 20th century Barsoom series featured green aliens from Mars, though in this case they weren't little at all, being about twice the height of humans. Yet another mention from the early 20th century comes from the 1908 edition of the Daily Kennebec Journal, where the term little green man is used referring to a Martian. By the time of Orson Welles' famed War of the Worlds broadcast in October of 1938, it would appear this idea was firmly established in pop culture. After the supposed mass panic that happened during that broadcast, which in truth didn't actually happen, contrary to popular belief, more on this in an upcoming video on our Highlight History channel, subscribe to that by the way, this nevertheless saw many columnists reporting on it the next day, using the term little green men synonymously with alien. As is often the case today, these accounts seem to mostly use the term in jest to poke fun at the whole thing rather than literally describing aliens. This trope has pretty much survived ever since in pop culture, with short green aliens appearing in countless fictional productions, including Doctor Who, Star Trek, Toy Story, and perhaps the most famous of all little green aliens, Jedi Master Yoda. Interestingly, despite widespread reference to little green men in many a news account describing potential abductions, among the alien abductions posited by ufologists as being somewhat credible, there has not yet been anywhere someone has claimed to have been abducted by little green men type aliens. Though lizard people are a thing, which we'll be getting to in an upcoming video, assuming the lizard people don't silence us first. In contrast to the lack of little green men abductions, little grey humanoids is a popular description given by those who claim to have been abducted, accounting for a whopping 43% of all alien abduction reports in the United States, 50% in Australia, and 90% in the United States' hat. As to why grey aliens prefer Canadians, we just think that's probably because they're really nice. Just as interesting is that only 12% of abduction reports in the UK and 20% in the rest of Europe describe some variant of grey-skinned aliens doing the abducting. So, where did the common idea of hairless, large-headed, black-eyed, grey-skinned aliens actually come from in the first place? The first documented instances of a description of such beings, though in this case with them being our evolved selves, comes from H.G. Wells's 1893 Man of the Year Million. In it, he describes humanity having evolved into large-headed, black, oval-eyed, short, grey-skinned beings similar to what is commonly depicted when most people today think of grey aliens. Wells later repeated similar descriptions in other works, including sometimes representing aliens. Clearly, Wells must have been in the lizard people's inner circle to know about the grey aliens long before anyone would ever be abducted by them. From there, Gustav Sandgren doubled down on this description of aliens in his 1933 book titled The Unknown Danger, where he states, "The creatures did not resemble any race of humans. They were shorter than the average Japanese, and their heads were big and bald, with strong square foreheads and very small noses and mouths and weak chins. What was most extraordinary about them were the eyes, large, dark, gleaming with a sharp gaze. They wore clothes made of soft grey fabric, and their limbs seemed to be similar to those of humans." Fast forwarding to 1947, the Roswell UFO incident purports to have featured little grey aliens, which has since further kept the trope alive. That said, perhaps no other event solidified the idea of grey aliens in pop culture more than one of the first ever instances of a supposed real-life alien abduction. The people abducted were a husband and wife couple named Barney and Betty Hill in 1961. In a nutshell, the couple were driving home from a trip late at night on September the 19th, 1961 in New Hampshire, when at approximately 10:30 p.m. Betty claims to have seen a mysterious light off in the distance. Eventually, the couple decided to stop the car and investigate, as well as allow their dog to water some trees. In the meantime, Barney used a pair of binoculars to get a closer look at the mysterious light and observed a flying saucer of some sort off in the distance. From here, there is a gap in their memories until they were about 35 miles down the road. Perplexed with about 2 hours of missing time, the missing memories of part of their road trip, minor scrapes and some damage to their clothing and back of their car, they otherwise shrugged it off and went to bed when they got home. Shortly thereafter, Betty read a book about UFOs and then began to have some strange dreams, with her speculating to Barney that maybe they had been abducted by aliens, as she vividly experienced in her dreams. Her husband, however, was having none of it at first, that is, until 2 years later, when he and Betty underwent hypnosis to try and draw out repressed memories, and then he started remembering the event himself. In short, Betty gave two accounts, one from her dreams and one from her supposedly recovered repressed memories, which differed considerably on several points. What she ended up supposedly remembering was some reasonably friendly, grey hairless aliens, initially claiming with huge bulbous noses, though she changed her story on that one later. The aliens then took them aboard their ship and gave them a thorough and violating examination. At one point, while chatting with Betty in English, but seemingly telepathically, one of the examiners showed her a star chart map of where they came from. Her husband also had similar memories, though less detailed, as apparently he kept his eyes closed much of the time because of the alien eyes feeling like they were boring into his brain. He did report being probed anally, as well as having some of his sperm extracted, among other things more or less similar to Betty's experience. However, among various discrepancies between their stories, he described the aliens as having hair and wearing Nazi-like uniforms. However, as we noted in our video about whether repressed memories are actually a thing, the methods used in hypnosis to try and recover suppressed memories are quite literally textbook ways to get people to create false memories, sometimes even quite fantastical ones. Thus, purported memories recovered in this way tend to be treated with a bit of skepticism in modern times. And in fact, even then, the psychiatrist who hypnotized them, Dr. Benjamin Simon, concluded this very thing, that while he fully believed Betty and then Barney were completely sincere that they had been abducted, the good doctor believed their memories were not real and simply inspired by Betty's dreams and research of various alien-related content. Dr. Simon was apparently well ahead of his time. On that note, a lot of the elements the couple described about the aliens resembled those already depicted in various works of fiction. Further, the technologies the the aliens used were amazingly antiquated, mirroring the types of things you'd expect of someone living in 1961. On top of that, a beacon light on Canyon Mountain existed that was fully visible on the road approximately where Betty and Barney claimed to have seen the mysterious light. Betty's later accounts of additional experiences with aliens would further erode her credibility in the eyes of most ufologists. As noted by the paranormal investigator Robert Schaefer, I was present at the National UFO Conference in New York City in 1980, at which Betty presented some of the UFO photos she had taken. She showed what must have been well over 200 slides, mostly of blips, blurs, and blobs against a dark background. These were supposed to be UFOs coming in close, chasing her car, landing, etc. After her talk had exceeded about twice its allocated time, Betty was literally jeered off the stage by what had been, at first, a very sympathetic audience. This incident, witnessed by many ufology leaders and top activists, removed any lingering doubts about Betty's credibility. She had none. In 1995, Betty Hill wrote a self-published book, A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. It is filled with obviously delusional stories, such as seeing entire squadrons of UFOs in flight and a truck levitating above the freeway. Nevertheless, the original incident made the news rounds and even inspired some predictions based on the event, helping to popularize and reinforce the notion of grey aliens, even if not exactly as is otherwise commonly depicted. In fact, because of Betty and Barney, grey aliens are sometimes called Zeta Reticulans. This comes from the fact that Betty's drawing of the star map she supposedly saw while on the ship was determined to line up with a binary system about 39.2 light-years away from Earth called Zeta Reticuli. That said, the idea that her depiction matched Zeta Reticuli was later debunked for various reasons. Nevertheless, the name has stuck. On top of helping to popularize the Greys, the Betty and Barney abduction ended up kicking off a slew of others claiming that they were likewise abducted, with relatively similar stories. The stereotypical view of grey aliens that had been around for over half a century up to that point was subsequently continually reinforced in cinema and TV, such as in the 1977 Close Encounters of the Third Kind, as well as the 1989 Communion, starring Christopher Walken, based off the New York Times best-selling book of the same name released 2 years before. After that came The X-Files, Stargate SG-1, South Park, and many more productions featuring some variant of the Greys, ensuring the stereotype lives on long past H.G. Wells, who seemingly originally came up with it, or so the lizard people would want to have us believe. And let's get into those bonus facts. While today pretty much everyone pronounces UFO as UFO, it turns out that's not the way the person who suggested the phrase unidentified flying object, one Edward J. Ruppelt, pronounced it. You see, when Ruppelt suggested the name to describe these types of sightings rather than flying saucer as was previously popular among the general public, he helpfully included a description of how to pronounce it. So how did he say it? Well, that was UFO. And while UFO did catch on, UFO certainly didn't. And now for another bonus fact. Ever wonder why people think Area 51 houses aliens? Well, want to know more? It turns out it's all because of one random man. In 1989, yes, that recently, a guy by the name of Robert Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas TV station saying he was a government scientist and stated that Area 51 was just chock full of alien technology. After that, interest in Area 51 and aliens really started to gain momentum. Now, we should probably mention that almost as soon as Lazar appeared on TV, every single one of his credentials was pulled to pieces. No school he claimed to attend had ever heard of him, and the science behind his presented hypotheses was soundly debunked. And yes, to really just drive the point home here, Roswell, UFOs, aliens, little green men, and Area 51 were in no way linked as far as popular public opinion was concerned until exactly one random dude went on TV and claimed that they were. Science. On that note, it's important to realize what Area 51 actually is. For all intents and purposes, and according to every government document ever released, Area 51 is a secret, but not so secret, military base where they test experimental pieces of military hardware. For example, experimental jets such as the SR-71 Blackbird and the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady were tested at the Area 51 base. The latter of which was actually the first piece of hardware publicly known to have been constructed and tested there. The site Area 51 was built on was first chosen due to the incredibly smooth land found on nearby lake beds, coupled with the area's natural inaccessibility. Both of these features made it perfect for testing aircraft like the Lockheed U-2, which required a large area of flat land from which it could take off and land, while at the same time being in an area enemies of the US couldn't, at the time, easily lay their peepers on. As for what it's like to work at Area 51, unlike pop culture would have you believe, the people who work there aren't forbidden from ever speaking to their family or are held in some sort sort of giant underground bunker. Just ask James Nose, who worked in the secret facility for decades. Though James has been sworn to secrecy about certain things, as is expected when you work on highly experimental classified government projects, he's free to talk about many of his experiences there. For example, James noted that he was always paid in cash, whereas others were paid in checks from companies they didn't work for. Even more interesting, when a plane from Area 51 crashed once, James was tasked with confiscating the cameras of a nearby family, who were quickly rewarded with a fat stack of cash for their silence about what they saw. So what about Roswell and Area 51? Surely there must have been some popular connection before the late 1980s, right? Well, not so much. Though today, some conspiracy theorists believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell was of alien origin and that it was or is now being stored at Area 51, when the incident in question first took place, Area 51 wasn't mentioned in any documentation from that time. This should come as zero surprise to anyone who knows their geography, as Area 51 is almost 1,000 miles from Roswell, so why they'd have transported it and the aliens inside all that way instead of to some other secret installation is a bit of a mystery, and certainly not something anyone in the public at the time would connect, even if it were true. And now for another bonus fact. Ever wonder what aliens might look like if we did encounter them? While you might think that this is unknowable, and to some extent that is correct, there is a notion called convergent evolution that at least gives us some indications. The general idea here comes from the fact that various life forms have independently evolved a lot of the same basic features on Earth, completely separate from each other. And given that many other planets would have relatively similar conditions as Earth in terms of some level of light, gravitational force, and living creatures needing to intake sustenance for energy, etc., it is likely that an intelligent and advanced species would have certain broad features we can make assumptions about. As Professor Harry E. Keller of Northeastern University notes, eyes? Of course. You'd have to see to be able to build a civilization. The squid has better eyes than we do, and the eye seems to have evolved separately a few times at least. Our alien will have eyes that may only resemble ours superficially. A lens and iris are almost an absolute requirement. The whites do not have to be white. Neither does the iris have to be colored in anything like the way ours are. How many eyes? One just will not do. Inability to perceive distance will lead to rapid extinction. Unless you can find a good reason for it, extra eyes create evolutionary baggage and will not persist, spiders notwithstanding. Eyes being important, they will be recessed and capable of being covered as necessary. Our aliens are not likely to be bug-eyed, though we cannot totally rule that out. Mouth must have means for ingestion of food. All large animals have some means to capture and swallow food. Some masticate it, others do not. Teeth are rather common on Earth, but other systems of eating are possible. The problem is that plants and animals have been in an evolutionary war for millennia. We inherit the outcome of that war. Teeth were necessary to eat plants that became more fibrous, an evolutionary reaction to being eaten. There are other ways to shear off plant food, such as what birds do. They chew in their gizzards. A similar line of thinking is that a technologically advanced species is likely to have a good way to manipulate objects in complex ways, as this is a huge boon to an advancement of a species in the first place. Thus, something like hands and opposable thumbs would also seem to be more likely to be present in a spacefaring life form that we might encounter. Some sort of hard protective structure to store the central processing unit, or units, i.e. the brain or brain centers, are also speculated to be likely for similar reasons to so many creatures on Earth evolving this feature. Evolutionary biologist Dr. Simon Conway Morris adds, "Certainly, it's not the case that every Earth-like planet will have life, let alone humanoids. But if you want a sophisticated plant, it will look awfully like a flower. If you want to fly, there's only a few ways you can do that. If you want to swim like a shark, there's only a few ways you can do that. If you want to invent warm-bloodedness like birds and mammals, there's only a few ways to do that. There is a growing interest in convergent evolution, but I'm always willing to push it as far as I can. I'll always say, show me anything which has only evolved once, and I'll try and jump up and say, no, I can give you another example. Convergence is ubiquitous, and if you think complex things are difficult to make, well, with great respect, think again." The sum of all this is to point out that while Hollywood often depicts humanoid-like intelligent beings for convenience in casting actors and reducing special effects budgets, it's not outside the realm of possibility that aliens really would be at least slightly humanoid, with some form of eyes, ears, hands, limbs for moving about and grabbing things, etc. Of course, having all these features doesn't necessarily mean looking that close to a human. After all, an octopus is not that far from the basic recipe for a species with the potential to be technologically advanced if they evolved the right means for communication and things of this nature. But it, at least according to this hypothesis, makes it not unlikely that we might encounter aliens at some point that look not too dissimilar to ourselves or something that we're familiar with. That said, Seth Shostak and Susan Schneider of the SETI Institute posit that it is far more likely that any other beings we encounter would be of the machine variety. Their reasoning is that, to begin with, as any species advances to the point of space travel or sending communications across vast distances in space, thus ones we are more likely to encounter, they will likely have come up with something like the computers we have today to offload various brainpower tasks to machinery. Ultimately, they will then advance those systems to the point where they are superior to the biological brain's potential. At some point beyond that, they will likely figure out how to transfer their own sentience and memories to the machines, or create machines that are themselves independently sentient. Because such machine beings would be superior to biological beings in countless ways, including ability to rapidly self-improve and replicate in much more advanced ways, they would ultimately come to dominate. Even in societies that took active steps to avoid this, these groups would have much more trouble with interstellar space travel than their machine alternates, and thus it would ultimately be unlikely for us to encounter those biologicals compared to our chances of encountering the machines. On that note, grey aliens are often described by supposed abductees as having seemingly artificially smooth skin, like it's made of some sort of polymer rather than being biological. This, combined with the fact that many abductees state that even when the greys were staring them straight in the eyes inches away from their faces, they could not detect any breathing or the like, has led some to speculate the greys are not actually biological beings, but rather robots, clearly created by the lizard people to do their bidding. To begin with, on July the 20th, 1969, the world looked on in awe as 39-year-old astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped off a ladder of the lunar module Eagle and onto the surface of the moon, becoming the first human to set foot on a natural celestial object. This moment, watched on television by over 650 million people worldwide, has gone down in history as one of mankind's greatest triumphs, redefining what humanity is capable of achieving. Over the next 3 years, a total of 6 Apollo missions and 12 astronauts would visit the moon, leaving behind scientific instruments and returning mineral samples that helped expand our understanding of the moon, the Earth, and the solar system. Or so most of us have been led to believe. Despite the Apollo program being one of the largest, most expensive, and most public undertakings in human history, for nearly 60 years, a once small but ever-growing dedicated group of conspiracy theorists have maintained that the whole endeavor was in fact an elaborate hoax, a piece of Hollywood flammery aimed at pumping up America's self-image and winning a propaganda victory against the Soviet Union. According to this theory, no humans have ever set foot on the moon, and the famous images beamed into millions of households were instead filmed on a soundstage on Earth. While anyone with a passing knowledge of history and conspiracy should be able to recognize these claims as total nonsense, they have gained a surprising amount of traction, with a 2005 poll revealing that nearly 25% of Americans aged 18 to 25 doubt that humans had ever walked on the moon. Yep. 1 in 4, despite living in an era when humans have access to more information than ever, showing that we did, in fact, land on the moon. But how did this conspiracy theory come about in the first place, and what hard observable evidence is there that the Apollo moon landings actually took place? While there were doubtless plenty of people in the 1960s who doubted that humans were capable of reaching the moon landing conspiracy theory as it exists today was started by one man named William Casing. Born in 1922 in Chicago, Casing served in the US Navy during World War II and in 1949 obtained a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Redlands in California. He then worked a variety of jobs, including as a salesman, insurance claim examiner, and cabinet maker, until landing a position as a technical writer for California-based aerospace company Rocketdyne. Deciding he had had enough of the rat race in 1963, Casing quit Rocketdyne and traveled the country in a trailer with his family, earning a living writing books on a wide variety of topics, including cooking, farming, taxes, motorcycles, and travel. However, he maintains an active interest in the ongoing manned space program, and as the years passed, he became more and more convinced that the United States government was being less than honest about the nation's spaceflight accomplishments. In 1976, 4 years after the Apollo program ended, Casing, propping himself up as an expert thanks to his very brief time as a technical writer for Rocketdyne, laid out his ideas in a self-published book titled We Never Landed on the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle. According to Casing, sometime in the late 1950s, he managed to get his hands on a top-secret NASA study examining the feasibility of landing on the moon. The report concluded, in his words, that the chance of success was something like 0.0017%. In other words, it was hopeless. Thus, when NASA announced in 1969 that Apollo 11 had successfully landed on the moon, Casing was immediately skeptical. Central to his doubts was the Apollo 1 disaster of February 21, 1967, in which a fire on the launch pad resulted in the deaths of astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed Weil, and Roger Chaffee, and set the Apollo program back by months. As Casing later explains, as late as 1967, 3 astronauts died in a horrendous fire on the launch pad. But as of 1969, we could suddenly perform manned flight upon manned flight with complete success. It's just against all statistical odds. According to Casing, sometime in the mid-1960s, NASA realized that it would not be able to meet former President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But rather than admit defeat, NASA decided instead to fake the whole thing. To accomplish this, the astronauts were secretly removed from the Saturn V rocket just prior to launch, and the empty rocket fired into space. The astronauts were then flown to a secret soundstage on Groom Lake Air Force Base in Nevada, better known as Area 51, where the landing and spacewalk were faked for the cameras. And when it came time for the astronauts to return to Earth, they were packed into the capsule, flown over the Pacific Ocean in a military transport plane, and parachuted into the water for the US Navy to recover. Casing never revealed which secret report he read contained the infamous 0.0017% probability of success, nor how NASA came up with such an incredibly precise figure. Indeed, there is no evidence that NASA conducted any sort of moon landing feasibility study in the 1950s, the agency only having been established in its modern form in July 1958. But as we shall see, this is far from the largest gap or the most ridiculous claim in Casing's theories. For example, when asked why NASA would bother with such an elaborate charade, Casing claimed, without any concrete evidence to support it, that the agency was working with the Defense Intelligence Agency to deceive the Soviet Union and claim a major propaganda victory. He also accused NASA and major aerospace companies of going along with the scheme in order to secure lucrative government contracts, stating they, both NASA and Rocketdyne, wanted the money to keep pouring in. I've worked in aerospace long enough to know that's their goal. As for how NASA managed to dupe the Soviets when the latter were closely monitoring all American spacecraft launches, Casing had an equally simple answer. NASA simply broadcast fake signals to fool ground stations into thinking a spacecraft was on its way to the moon. How exactly this was accomplished, Casing never specified. Moving on from there, in his book, Casing claims that the faked moon landings were taped live, with only a 7-second delay between recording and broadcast. This meant that if a fly were to buzz across the soundstage, the recording technicians would have only seconds to react and avoid giving away the whole charade. And just how did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins spend their free time in between filming sessions? Well, according to Casing, they flew to Las Vegas, rented a room at the Sands Hotel, and hung out at casinos and strip clubs. Casing even claims that the astronauts had such a good time in Vegas that one of them, allegedly Buzz Aldrin, got into a fistfight over a stripper, and the 3 could only be lured back to Area 51 for filming by providing them with buxom showgirls, and we really are not making this up, cheese sandwiches. No matter what objections were leveled at his theories, Casing always had ready answers, albeit ones devoid of any supporting evidence. For example, when asked where the moon rocks the astronauts collected came from, Casing claimed they were either meteorites recovered from Antarctica or fakes created in a NASA geology lab. But what neither Casing nor subsequent conspiracy theorists have been able to explain away is how NASA and the US government were able to keep such a massive conspiracy under wraps. As anyone who has ever tried to keep a secret knows, the greater the number of people involved, the harder it is to stop the truth from leaking out. For your reference, at its peak, the Apollo program employed nearly 500,000 people nationwide, but in the 5 decades since the project ended, not a single one of them has come forward with credible evidence that the endeavor was an elaborate sham. Always one with a ready answer, Casing claims that NASA only let those who needed to know that the project was a hoax, while letting everyone else believe that their work, the work that, if complete to the satisfaction of the countless scientists and engineers involved, ignorance of the conspiracy would in fact allow a man to walk on the moon, was genuine. Anyone who did know of the hoax that threatened to spill the beans was either paid off, promoted, threatened, or in certain cases, murdered. Despite the sheer absurdity of his claims and the fact that his book was hardly a bestseller, Casing's writings soon gained a small but dedicated following and laid the groundwork for the thriving moon landing hoax community. Had Casing been any other man at any other time, his ideas would likely have been ignored and disappeared into history. But his experience working at Rocketdyne, brief as it was, lent his theories an air of credibility as a supposed expert, despite the fact that he wasn't even a little bit of an expert. And people ran with it. His ideas also fit perfectly into a cultural shift then taking place in America. While the 1950s and 1960s had been full of optimism about a bright technological future and celebrations of American exceptionalism, by the mid-1970s, the American people had become thoroughly disillusioned with their country. The disastrous quagmire of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and the revelations about top-secret programs like MKUltra mind control experiments caused people to lose trust in their government. With this eroded trust in those in authority, conspiracy theorists of all kinds popped up like mushrooms, which has only gotten worse and worse in the modern era, with the root cause being more or less the same on some levels. Casing's ideas were also given an unexpected boost by the 1978 film Capricorn 1, written and directed by Peter Hyams. In the film, NASA, realizing that its upcoming manned mission to Mars is doomed to fail, decides to fake the whole thing instead. Just as in Casing's hypothetical Apollo scenario, the 3 astronauts are removed from the capsule just prior to launch, and the empty rocket is fired into space. The astronauts are then flown to a soundstage on a remote military base where the Mars landing is staged for the cameras. However, when the empty spacecraft burns up on re-entry due to a faulty heat shield, the US government decides that the astronauts must die to avoid revealing the hoax, resulting in a fraught chase across the desert. The idea for Capricorn 1 came from the same feeling of distrust for the US government that drove Casing to develop his own theories, with writer-director Hyams later musing, "There was one event, Apollo 11, of really enormous importance that had almost no witnesses, and the only verification we have came from a TV camera." Hyams went on to explain, "Whenever there was something on the news about a space shuttle, they would cut to a studio in St. Louis where there was a simulation of what was going on. I grew up in the generation where my parents basically believed if it was in the newspaper it was true. That turned out to be bullshit. My generation was brought up to believe television was true, and that was bullshit too. So I was watching these simulations and wondering what would happen if someone faked a whole story." In the wake of Casing's book and Hyams' films, the moon landing hoax theory took on a life of its own, with others adding their own sensational details to the conspiracy. At one point, theorists determined that the moon landing sequences had been directed by none other than legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick for no other reason that his 2001 A Space Odyssey, released a year before Apollo 11, was one of the most realistic science fiction films ever made, featuring groundbreaking special effects. Why Kubrick would agree to help the US government perpetrate such a hoax has never been adequately explained, though most conspiracy theorists simply turn to the tried and tested excuse that he was bullied or blackmailed into it. Later theorists have speculated that Kubrick secretly confessed his involvement in the hoax via subliminal messages hidden in his 1980 horror film The Shining. These supposed clues include the infamous Room 237, allegedly meant to represent the 237,000-kilometer average distance between the Earth and the Moon, and the fact that in certain scenes the character of Danny Torrance wears an Apollo 11 sweater. Perhaps more than any other part of the moon landing conspiracy, this claim in particular strains credibility. After all, how could Kubrick, infamous perfectionist that he was, ever have allowed Neil Armstrong to flub his iconic line, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind"? The fact that all these theories crumple so easily under the weight of the slightest scrutiny helps explain why, in 2001, Casing released an updated edition of his book titled Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? In this, he revises many of his claims. For example, in the first edition, Casing claims that the giant Rocketdyne F1 engines used in the first stage of the Saturn V were discovered to be too unreliable. So NASA instead hid several H1 rocket engines from the earlier Saturn 1B rocket inside the F1 engine bells. This is one of the easiest of Casing's claims to debunk, as even a cursory look at the H1's dimensions and performance reveal that not only could these engines not have fit inside the F1 as Casing described, but they would not have had enough thrust to lift the Saturn V into orbit, even with the propellant tanks partially drained. Furthermore, close-up footage taken by NASA of Saturn V's lifting off clearly show the F1 engines working just as advertised, with no smaller engine clusters in sight. Faced with such rebuttals, Casing revised his story that the F1 engines actually did work as intended, but that the rocket was ditched in the ocean as soon as it was out of sight. Interestingly, this particular theory does contain a small grain of truth, of the type that allows successful conspiracy theories to gain traction and take off. Early in the F1's engine development, Rocketdyne did indeed encounter serious issues with combustion instability that threatened to kill the entire Apollo program. However, through diligent trial and error, engineers, as they are wont to do for being engineers, managed to solve the problem in time, and not a single one of the 13 Saturn V's launched suffered any sort of serious failure. Other changes in the 2001 edition of Casing's book regards the role of astronauts in perpetuating the hoax. While in the 1976 edition, Casing claims that the astronauts never left the Earth and spent the entire mission hanging around in Area 51 in Las Vegas, in his revised version they actually did fly into space but remained in Earth orbit while pre-recorded footage of the landing was broadcast around the world. There's no word on whether they still had cheese sandwiches and strippers with them while circling the globe. Throughout his life, Casing continued to level various outlandish accusations at NASA, including that the Apollo 1 fire was deliberately set in order to stop astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee from spilling the beans on the upcoming hoax conspiracy. For those following along with Casing's narrative, this would mean that he is saying that the fire was A, a deliberate action inflicted by NASA upon itself, and B, an example of NASA's incompetence that forced the agency to fake the moon landings. Incredibly, Casing went even further, claiming that NASA deliberately blew up the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986 in order to silence teacher in space Krista McAuliffe. Why would NASA do this when McAuliffe's mission was a publicity stunt meant to rekindle public interest in space travel? Well, according to Casing, Krista McAuliffe, the only civilian and only woman aboard, refused to go along with the lie that you couldn't see stars in space. So they blew her up along with 6 other people to keep that lie under wraps. Adding to the long list of Casing's claims that are ridiculously easy to debunk, it is worth pointing out that Krista McAuliffe was not the only woman on board. NASA astronaut Judith Resnick was also killed in that tragedy. Given these outrageous accusations, it's no surprise that Casing and his followers have run afoul of several astronauts and other NASA personnel. For example, in 1996, Apollo 8 and 13 astronaut Jim Lovell publicly stated, "This guy is wacky. His position makes me feel angry. We spent a lot of time getting ready to go to the moon. We spent a lot of money. We took great risks. And it's something everybody in this country should be proud of." Lovell also wrote to Casing asking him to tear up your manuscript and pursue a project that has some meaning. Leave a legacy you can be proud of, not some trash whose readers will doubt your sanity. In response, Casing proceeded to sue Lovell for slander and defamation. However, the case was ultimately thrown out of court and nothing came of the affair. Understandably, Casing's death in 2005 at the age of 83 was met with mixed feelings by those who had participated in the Apollo program, with few managing to muster much sympathy for a man who accused NASA of multiple murders. More recently, on September the 9th, 2002, 37-year-old cab driver, conspiracy theorist, and documentary filmmaker Bart Sibrel invited Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin to the Beverly Hills Hotel under the pretense of filming a children's TV show on space. When Aldrin arrived at the hotel, Sibrel and his camera crew ambushed him, with Sibrel attempting to make Aldrin swear on a Bible that he had walked on the moon. Sibrel then proceeded to call Aldrin a liar and a coward, at which point, in a moment that doubtless elicited cheers throughout the space exploration community, the 72-year-old astronaut proceeded to punch Sibrel right in the face. But while these outlandish alternate histories of the Apollo program are largely unsupported by evidence and ridiculously easy to debunk, many conspiracy theorists point to supposedly incontrovertible physical evidence hidden in photographs and footage of the Apollo missions, which allegedly proves that the landings were faked. So, how do these claims stand up? Here are some of the most common mistakes allegedly made by NASA, which according to conspiracy theorists prove that the moon landings were faked on a soundstage. No stars appear in the sky in any of the astronauts' photographs, despite the moon having no atmosphere to obscure them. The American flags planted by the astronauts fly straight and appear to flap in the breeze, despite being allegedly deployed in a vacuum. The shadows cast by rocks, the astronauts and their equipment appear to fall in wildly different directions, despite the only light source being the sun. This proves the photos were taken on a soundstage lit by multiple studio lights. In one photograph taken during the Apollo 16 mission, a rock bears an obvious letter C, proving that it is in fact a studio prop and not a natural object. In films and photographs, the lunar module's rocket engine produces no visible flames, leaves no crater on the lunar surface, and does not kick up a massive dust cloud, revealing it to be nothing but a studio miniature. The aiming crosshairs on the Apollo photographs sometimes appear to lie behind objects, indicating that the photos are actually composites faked in a darkroom. The crispness of the astronauts' footprints indicates the presence of water in the soil, which is impossible if they were taken on the moon. The astronauts would never have survived the journey through the Van Allen belts, large zones of lethal radiation surrounding the Earth. Now, you might want to be sitting down for the next part because it's going to come as a major shock, but these arguments demonstrate total ignorance of Apollo equipment and procedures as well as the laws of physics and are all easily debunked. For example, no stars appear in the astronauts' photographs simply because their cameras were not set up to capture them. All the astronaut spacewalks took place during the lunar day when sunlight reflecting off the lunar surface would have been extremely bright. In order to take clear pictures, the apertures on their cameras had to be cranked down, making the stars far too faint to show up on film. Photographic procedures also neatly solve the mystery of the disappearing crosshairs. The crosshairs themselves were etched directly into the glass optics of the cameras, meaning that light reflecting at certain angles could make some parts of the crosshair appear lighter than others. When the negatives were subsequently developed, enlarged, and copied, these differences were magnified, causing the pale sections to disappear entirely, and the crosshairs to appear to sit behind rather than over certain objects. As for the mysterious C on the rock in the Apollo 16 photograph, this is also merely a photographic aberration. The letter does not appear in the original negative and is likely a stray piece of hair or dust that was accidentally captured during the enlargement and copying process. Furthermore, as many veteran film crews and props masters are quick to point out, nowhere is it common practice to label props and scenery with large, easily visible letters or numbers. Other purported evidence of the moon landings being fake is easily dismissed by closely examining the Apollo hardware. For instance, NASA planners knew full well that an American flag hanging limply in a vacuum would hardly be the most majestic or patriotic sight, which is why the lunar flag assemblies included a thin horizontal rod to keep the flag flying proudly. As for flags appearing to flap in the breeze in still photographs, this is merely an illusion caused by the flags being wrinkled. In footage of the flags being planted, the flags only move while the astronauts are handling them, and for a few seconds afterwards as the flags swing like pendulums in the vacuum before finally falling still. A close examination of the lunar module propulsion system also reveals why it produced no visible flame and left no visible crater on the lunar surface. Both the descent and ascent engines on the lunar module were fueled by a combination of aerosine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide. The reaction of these produces a pale, nearly colorless flame. Barely visible in high-definition footage of Earth-based rockets like the Titan II ballistic missile, this exhaust would have been invisible to the primitive television cameras used to record lunar liftoffs, giving the lunar module ascent stage the appearance of a studio model being lifted by a string. But what about the lack of a crater? Well, lunar gravity is only about a sixth as strong as it is on Earth, meaning that far less powerful and destructive engines were required to get the lunar module onto and off of the lunar surface. Indeed, the lunar module descent engine had a maximum thrust of around 4,500 kilograms, about the same as the smallest rocket to achieve Earth orbit, the Japanese SS-520. This engine was also significantly throttled down during the final approach, further limiting its destructive potential. Furthermore, much of the lunar surface consists of hard bedrock covered by a thin layer of lunar soil or regolith, rarely more than a couple of centimeters deep. Thus, on landing, the lunar module would have not blasted a deep crater, but merely displaced a small amount of dust. But what about the lack of a gigantic billowing dust cloud? Well, on Earth, dust clouds are caused by fine dust particles becoming suspended in the air. In the absence of an atmosphere, dust does not billow, it simply falls to the ground at the rate of gravitational acceleration, but more on that in a bit. And speaking of dust, according to the conspiracy theorists, the remarkable crispness of the footprints the Apollo astronauts left in the lunar soil is only possible if said soil contains water, proving that the photographs were taken on Earth and not on the dry, airless lunar surface. But this argument ignores the unique properties of the lunar environment. The lunar regolith is produced over millions of years by the continual bombardment of the lunar surface by meteorites. Once settled on the lunar surface, the regolith is acted upon by the solar wind and other high-energy subatomic particles, further breaking it down into fine and extremely sharp and jagged particles. The bombardment also imparts the dust particles with a strong electrostatic charge, allowing them to clump together much like damp soil does on Earth. Indeed, this property proved a major problem for the Apollo astronauts, as the charged, highly abrasive dust stuck to everything, including the astronauts' spacesuits, and it wore down and damaged a great deal of sensitive equipment. This electrostatic cling, along with the lack of flowing water, winds, and other erosive forces on the lunar surface, also means that the astronauts' footprints will likely remain crisp and perfectly preserved for millions of years until they are finally covered over by slowly accumulating layers of falling dust. While the previous examples are relatively straightforward to debunk, there still remains the curious phenomenon of the cockeyed shadows in the astronaut photographs. At first glance, this argument appears to indicate that the conspiracy theorists might actually be onto something. After all, if the only light source was the sun, wouldn't all the shadows be parallel? But once again, the solution to this supposed mystery is relatively straightforward, and was famously demonstrated in a 2008 episode of the TV show Mythbusters. In that episode, host Adam Savage constructed a scale model of the Apollo 11 landing site complete with miniature lunar lander and lit the entire scene with a single spotlight to simulate the sun. Savage discovered that the uneven terrain caused the shadows to veer off in different directions, giving the illusion of multiple light sources. But what about the most persistent and seemingly scientific argument against humans traveling to the moon, that the astronauts would have been fried by the intense radiation of the Van Allen belts? To the conspiracy theorists' credit, the Van Allen radiation belts are a very real phenomenon and do pose a serious risk to astronauts venturing beyond low Earth orbit. The twin donut-shaped regions, which lie at an altitude of 600 to 13,000 kilometers for the inner belt and 13,500 to 40,000 kilometers for the outer belt, are the result of the Earth's magnetic field capturing and accelerating high-energy subatomic particles from the solar wind and other cosmic sources. In certain places, the belts are populated by large numbers of protons with energies exceeding 100 mega-electron volts, which would kill a human within minutes. So, how did NASA get around this seemingly impenetrable barrier? Well, by doing just that. Going around it. While certain parts are extremely dangerous, the Van Allen belts are not uniform in density, with outlying zones containing significantly fewer higher energy particles. The belts are also relatively narrow, occupying only a fraction of the path between the Earth and the Moon. NASA planners were thus able to design the Apollo spacecraft's translunar injection, or TLI, course to skirt around the edges of the Van Allen belts and avoid the more dangerous zones. The time spent within the belts themselves was also extremely brief, around 60 minutes total for both the outbound and return flights, meaning the astronauts were exposed to only minimal amounts of radiation. The spacecraft itself also incorporated a great deal of radiation shielding in the form of aluminium plates, instrument panels, and propellant and oxygen tanks, further reducing the crew's exposure. Indeed, the astronauts' total exposure upon returning from the moon was found to be 0.46 rads, equivalent to 46 chest x-rays. Thus, while the Van Allen belts were indeed a known and serious hazard, with a little planning, this obstacle was easily overcome, almost as if NASA has a lot of people working there who know exactly what they're doing. But while debunking these common arguments clearly reveals the flimsy evidence on which most moon landing conspiracy theories are built, ultimately all this proves is that if the moon landing was faked, NASA did not make any obvious mistakes. It does not definitively prove that the Apollo landings actually took place. So how can we physically confirm in the present day that humans actually walked on the moon? One method is to shine a laser at the moon. All 6 Apollo missions deployed a piece of equipment called the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSEP, an automated laboratory for studying the lunar environment. Powered by a radioisotope thermal generator, or RTG, the ALSEPs were designed to remain on the lunar surface and transmit data on seismic activity, subatomic particles, and other phenomena back to Earth. In addition to the main ALSEP package, Apollos 11, 14, and 15 also deployed a device known as the Lunar Laser Ranging Experiment, or LLR, a small array of corner retroreflectors that reflect light back in the direction it arrives. These were designed to allow scientists to accurately measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon. To accomplish this, a powerful laser, such as the Apache Point Observatory Lunar Laser Ranging Operation, or APOLLO, in New Mexico, is fired at the LRRs on the lunar surface, and the time for the beam to bounce back is measured. Given the extreme distances involved and the small size of the target, actually hitting the reflectors is something of a challenge, which scientists liken to using a rifle to hit a moving dime 3 kilometers away. Furthermore, only a very small proportion, about 1 in 1 sextillion of the photons fired at the moon, make it back to Earth and require specialized sensors to detect. Yet, despite these challenges, using the LRR, scientists are able to measure the distance to the moon with an accuracy of a few millimeters, the equivalent of measuring the distance between Los Angeles and New York to within the width of a human hair. This extraordinary accuracy has allowed scientists to determine, among other things, that the moon has a liquid core, wobbles about its axis, and is gradually moving away from the Earth at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year. The LRRs continue to be used for research to the present day, the only part of the Apollo ALSEP still in working order. While the existence of the LRRs should theoretically confirm the reality of the Apollo missions, unfortunately, in this case, history does give the conspiracy theorists a plausible out, for the Apollo LRRs are not the only retroreflectors on the moon. In 1970 and 1973, the Soviet Union landed 2 robotic Lunokhod rovers on the lunar surface. In addition to television cameras, spectrometers, soil probes, and radiation detectors, the Lunokhods also carried laser retroreflector arrays, which continue to be used for experiments alongside the Apollo LRRs. Thus, the presence of retroreflectors on the moon does not definitively prove that humans set foot there, simply that humans definitely managed to get things to the moon. But if seeing truly is believing, then why not send a spacecraft to photograph the lunar surface and bring back direct photographic evidence of the Apollo landings? Well, this is exactly what NASA did in 2009 when it launched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, into lunar orbit. While LRO's primary mission is to map the lunar surface and help find suitable sites for future manned and unmanned missions, in the course of this mission, the spacecraft passed over and photographed the landing sites of all 6 Apollo missions. These photographs, taken from altitudes between 20 and 165 kilometers above the surface, clearly show the hardware left behind by the astronauts, including the lunar module descent stages, the ALSEP instrument packages, and the lunar roving vehicles, or LRVs, as well as the extensive patterns of tracks left by the LRVs and the astronauts' feet. Of course, conspiracy theorists will inevitably claim that these photographs were faked, but spacecraft from China, India, and Japan have also independently photographed the Apollo landing sites. Why any of these nations would play along with a 60-year-old American hoax is not clear. But if even that doesn't convince you, then allow us to reveal our trump card, the ultimate evidence that humans did actually walk on the moon and that the entire Apollo program was not in fact faked on a soundstage: the dust. For the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions in 1971 and 1972, the astronauts were equipped with the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or LRV, a folding, electrically powered moon buggy that allowed them to explore a greater area of the lunar surface. Footage of this vehicle driving around on the lunar surface reveals a curious phenomenon. The dust kicked up by the wheels simply falls back in a straight line rather than billowing as it would on Earth. And it also falls far more slowly. This makes sense, as the moon has no atmosphere and air is required for dust to billow. Lunar gravity is only 1/6 as powerful as that on Earth, meaning that objects accelerate toward the lunar surface at only 1.6 meters per second squared. Well, so what? You might be asking, how does this prove that humans walked on the moon? To understand why, consider what it would have taken to fake this footage on a soundstage. Simulating the motion of particulates like smoke, fog, and dust is one of the most difficult challenges in movie visual effects, so much so that even today's most powerful CGI rendering software struggles to achieve realistic-looking results. Faking the dust would have thus been far beyond the capabilities of analog 1970s visual effects. Indeed, even 2001: A Space Odyssey, whose special effects are often cited by conspiracy theorists as evidence that director Stanley Kubrick helped fake the moon landings, doesn't bother to accurately depict the behavior of dust in a vacuum. In an early scene where a spacecraft touches down on the moon, the dust billows just as it does on Earth. Thus, to achieve a realistic dust effect on Earth, NASA would have had no choice but to film a full-sized lunar rover, or at the very least a remote-controlled model, in an enormous vacuum chamber, a truly monumental undertaking. To be fair, NASA does operate a large number of vacuum chambers for testing spacecraft prior to launch, and the cost of building a vacuum soundstage would have been significantly lower than actually going to the moon. But even if NASA had gone to such extraordinary lengths to get the behavior of the lunar dust just right, there would still be the problem of gravity. While the reduced weight of larger objects like astronauts themselves could theoretically have been simulated using cables and counterweights, the slow fall of the lunar dust would have been all but impossible to fake. In order to replicate both the effects of vacuum and reduced gravity simultaneously, a hypothetical vacuum soundstage would have had to have been mounted in an aircraft such as NASA's infamous KC-135 Vomit Comet and run through a series of parabolic arcs while the cameras rolled, all to achieve a physical effect that most of the general public would not have even noticed. That's not to mention, in all of this, once again, the Soviets would have liked nothing better than to embarrass the US by revealing that the landings were a hoax. Yet, like the rest of us, but with far more sophisticated equipment than a TV TV, they closely monitored the spacecraft and every other facet of the manned missions to the moon. As you might imagine from all of this, given the incredible scope such a deceit would have had to entail, spanning hundreds of thousands of individuals, virtually all of whom would have had to have been ignorant of the hoax and thus actually doing the real work that would have put a man on the moon, when all things considered, it actually becomes easier just to go to the moon than to fake it. But all the material and historical evidence aside, the real question when it comes to moon landing conspiracy theories is this. If Apollo 11 was fake and only intended to win a propaganda victory, why then were the follow-up missions? If the Apollo program was meant to showcase America's technological superiority, why did two missions, Apollo 1 and Apollo 13, end in near or total disaster? And if all the landings were faked, why did NASA stop at only 6? Viewed objectively with all its triumphs, tragedies, and random twists of fate, the history of the Apollo program and the US space program as a whole reads far more like actual messy reality than some carefully orchestrated propaganda hoax. But regardless of logic or evidence, some people simply believe what they want to believe and don't bother to ever look deeper into the actual hard data on an issue. And so it is that the moon landing conspiracy theory, among countless others that are also relatively easily debunked with even a cursory dive into the issue, doesn't seem likely to disappear anytime soon. Given the surprising longevity of William Casing's harebrained ideas and the growing popularity of some of them in an era when more information than ever is available for people to look up and disprove the hoax theory, it is truly a case of one small step for a man, one giant leap for willfully ignorant kind.
So-called chemtrails, though more technically known as contrails, first appeared behind planes going all the way back to the earliest days of high-altitude flight. One of the earliest known surviving references of such occurred when an American soldier by the name of Captain Ward Wells observed a peculiar sight in the heavens in October of 1918, with his letter written on the subject eventually being published in Scientific American not long after. It read, "Our attention was first drawn to the sky by the sudden appearance of several strange and startling clouds, long, graceful, looping ribbons of white. These were tapering to a point at one end, and at the other, where they dissolved into nothingness, 60 degrees across the sky, were about as broad as the width of a finger held arm's distance from the eye. One close observation we noticed some distance ahead of each cloud pointed the tiny speck of a chase plane. Apparently, the churning of the air was all that was needed to upset the delicately balanced meteorological conditions and precipitate this strange cloud formation. I had seen ships leave their tracks in the clouds similar to those of little sea animals in the wet sands at the shore, but never before had I seen a plane writing in white upon the blue slate of the sky." With the rise of commercial airline traffic, these peculiar cloud formations behind planes have become commonplace. But what actually causes contrails, and why don't they always appear behind planes? In a nutshell, contrails, much like any other cloud, are mostly made up of water suspended in the air, hence the name contrail, which is derived from two words, condensation and trail. Contrails are created by planes via one of two ways. First, as the airplane passes through the air, it creates areas of low pressure, for instance above the wings as a byproduct of the shape of the wing. This sudden drop in pressure can cause the air temperature to drop below the dew point around certain parts of the plane. If this happens, water in the air may condense into little droplets. These droplets may even freeze if the air temperature is cold enough, but either way, the result will usually be a very short-lived streak of water vapor behind the plane. Beyond potentially seeing this just behind or above the wing flaps when they are extended, in some cases you can briefly observe this phenomenon in the vortices of air created at the ends of the wings. In this case, you'll see spiraling, corkscrew-looking vapor trailing the plane's wingtips. You may also observe this effect in the intake of the engines of commercial airplanes if humidity levels are high enough. As in the other cases, this is caused by a drop in air pressure resulting in water condensing in the intake, creating something of a little cloud inside said intake. Similarly, you occasionally might see contrails form at the tips of propellers in certain conditions for the same reason. All this said, these types of contrails aren't the ones you're seeing when you look up high in the sky as commercial planes fly overhead. Rather, this type of low-pressure induced contrail is more likely to show up when a plane is making high-speed maneuvers in high-humidity air. For example, it's not uncommon to see this when a fighter jet takes off from an aircraft carrier. So what about the far more commonly observed contrails streaming behind planes flying at high altitude? Well, this is a byproduct of burning jet fuel in air that is extremely cold, though otherwise they aren't really any different from the former contrails. They're both simply caused by water condensing. Just in one case it's the water already in the atmosphere condensing, and in the other case it's water that's being introduced into the air. Specifically, as the jet fuel burns, aside from other things the exhaust introduces into the atmosphere like unburned fuel and various particles, it mostly expels carbon dioxide and water. When at high altitude, where temperatures are often well below freezing, this expelled water vapor, combined with the various particles also expelled, providing nucleation sites for the water, will sometimes condense and then freeze, with the result being a long white cloud being formed behind the plane. This usually begins at some distance behind the engines, as when the exhaust is initially expelled, it's quite hot. This is not totally dissimilar to how when you breathe out from your mouth during the winter, you'll often see white vapor forming several centimeters outside of your mouth as the moisture in your breath encounters the frigid air around. Further, if the air is quite dry, the mini cloud forming outside your mouth will tend to dissipate very rapidly, whereas in days with higher humidity, it will last a little longer. A similar thing is occurring in planes, but there's a lot more water vapor, there's a lot more nucleation sites being expelled, and it's often all occurring in more extreme temperatures, which means that the contrails can last for several hours. Furthermore, if the humidity is high enough, they may even potentially expand into otherwise natural-looking cirrus clouds. This occurs as water from the surrounding atmosphere condenses around nucleation sites in the contrails, and wind slowly disperses the contrail over a wide area. This tendency of contrails to stick around for long periods of time is also a phenomenon that's been regularly observed from the earliest days of high-altitude flight. On this note, if you notice that contrails above you form and then dissipate quickly, you can likely expect a continuation of clear weather that day, whereas if the contrails stick around for a long time and are seen to expand greatly in the interim, this means the air at high altitude is likely very humid, increasing the chances that you may have clouds, rains, or storm on the horizon. Or, it could just be the Illuminati messing with you again. Now let's jump into some bonus facts. Meteors can also cause contrail cloud formation, and this phenomenon has been documented for thousands of years. In fact, when one Major Rudolf Schroeder attempted to set a new altitude record in February of 1920, his plane's rather rapid descent after he passed out around 36,000 feet was initially misinterpreted by people on the ground as a meteor falling. You see, they couldn't see his little plane, which was an open cockpit Lepaire biplane, from that far away, but they could see the contrail that formed behind it as it plummeted towards the Earth. As for why he suddenly found himself in such a dive, it turns out Schroeder was suffering from oxygen deprivation. In an attempt to find his emergency oxygen, he briefly removed his goggles to see better, with the result being the moisture on his eyes almost freezing instantaneously. Not long after, he passed out, only regaining consciousness a few thousand feet above the ground, at which point he was successfully able to pull out of the dive and land, despite his vision being damaged, it turns out partially permanently. Now for another bonus fact, while many scientists correctly hypothesized what caused contrails once they started popping up around World War I, it wouldn't be until after World War II that a solid theory on exactly what conditions contrails would form under was settled on. In America, one Herbert Ampelman ultimately came up with such a system of prediction in 1953 with his guide on the subject widely used for decades after. It was no coincidence that concerted effort into figuring this out was put forth during World War II. Contrails provide a major problem for military planes trying to go unnoticed, and thus there was great need to figure out what exact atmospheric conditions were likely to produce contrails so the military planes could avoid those regions. Unfortunately, atmospheric conditions are notoriously unpredictable, and so even with such a guide, pilots also had to keep an eye out for whether their plane was producing a contrail at any given moment. Towards this end, the U-2 spy plane was equipped with a rear view mirror to allow the pilot to see if such a thing was happening. If it was, the general rule was to adjust altitude until the contrail stopped forming. Other efforts by the military have been put forth to stop contrails from forming via tweaking the makeup of the fuel so as to produce less particles in the exhaust and thus less nucleation sites for the water vapor to condense around.
Ask people to know conspiracy theories that they've heard of, and inevitably you'll hear the name Freemasons brought up. Our conceptions of them are influenced by arcane symbols on the American greenback and older government buildings, vague conjectures of their involvement in revolutions, wacky fringe radio hosts rambling about conspiracy theories, and popular culture. Freemasonry is featured in high school standards of literature like Edgar Allan Poe's Cask of Amontillado, to throwaway airport novels like Dan Brown's Lost Symbol. Well, put the tinfoil hat on and your best ceremonial robes, because today we're going to break down some myths about the Freemasons, who this group are, and what they actually do. To begin with, Freemasons are simply a fraternity organized into lodges around the world. They focus their efforts on the moral cultivation of members of the club. This goal is achieved through initiations and rituals, with the individual over time moving up ranks, called degrees. These degrees can vary between lodges, but the Freemasons started with 3 degrees. Luckily for us, ritual origins and meanings are discussed in detail in Freemason literature available for public consumption. In fact, what might surprise you is that for a so-called secret society, many of their rituals, doctrines, and day-to-day ongoings are not actually secret at all. Masonry publications go back to the 18th century and continue openly to this day. Periodicals, magazines, books, websites, and so much more open media are put out by Freemasons for other Freemasons and the general public. Of course, our obvious overlords could make up anything, so even if you do not want to take their word for it, we have primary sources and ritual objects recovered from anti-Masonry purges by various regimes to attempt to verify the public stories. Combined, all these publications and the surviving post-Cold War references are great sources for academic Freemasonry studies. So, what do we know for sure? While conspiracy theories and the Freemasons' own founding myths place them at a much earlier point in history, the first lodge was probably founded in the 1710s. We don't know when exactly, but internal Masonry sources claim the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster was the original. At first, Freemasons gathered in pubs, cafes, and other public establishments, and even later named their lodges after these locations. As to what they got up to, the first Freemasons discussed the evolving philosophies and scientific discoveries ushered in during the Enlightenment, among many other similar things. The Grand Lodge of London and Westminster was the superior lodge during the early era. By the mid-18th century, Freemasonry was widespread all over Europe. In lockstep of this spread was this so-called secret society's not-so-secret practice of widespread Freemason publications, including such well-publicized works meant to elucidate rules and rituals for Freemasons, like their Constitution in 1723 and Explanations of Rituals in 1730. Both publications helped many prospective members understand Freemasonry before trying to join up, though even in the early days these publications were used by its opponents to attack them. While this late dating might surprise many, the Freemasons drew on older Masonry guilds and fraternities in various ways. Most pertinently, in medieval times, these guilds took care of skilled workers who cut designs into stone rather than laying stones. In the Renaissance, with the flourishing Hellenic philosophy and architecture, the guilds evolved to incorporate classical and philosophical elements as their craft evolved. The Renaissance also saw a flourishing of esotericism in Europe, a form of spirituality that includes striving for spiritual knowledge on an individual level. Jewish Kabbalah, which included mystical readings of the Hebrew Bible, became Christianized in Renaissance circles. Other esoteric currents important in the founding of Freemasonry included the Hermetic tradition, stemming from Gnosticism, and Rosicrucian fraternities based on a stream of esoteric Christianity. These fraternities and circles allowed laymen access to a form of Christian mysticism that would be hard to obtain outside of monastic orders. Eventually, non-operative members, meaning non-Masons, would join the Masonry guilds to discuss Hellenic and esoteric currents until we had the fraternal organization the Freemasons would grow out of in the early 18th century. All this said, Freemasons allege a much earlier history for themselves, with ties to biblical events influenced by Christian Kabbalah. They see their origins in the building of Solomon's temple. The temple architect Hiram was commissioned by Solomon to design and build this temple. Freemasons allege he was murdered by some of the workers because he wouldn't give them God's true name. These workers buried him outside of said temple. Solomon sent Hiram's Freemason associates to find him, which they did after some time, and reburied him in the Holy of Holies, or the Sanctum Sanctorum, the area of the temple where only priests could enter and see God. The Hiramic origin plays an important part in Freemason rituals. The initiate who takes the role of Hiram is symbolically murdered, buried, and rediscovered by his Freemason peers, and then symbolically interred in the Holy of Holies. Another mythic origin ties the Freemasons to the Knights Templar. Accused of heresy by the Catholic Church as secret Satanists, for Freemasons they helped bring the legend of Hiram to Europe and merge with the Scottish Mason fraternities when they returned home. This supposed connection was later one of many contributing factors to the persecution by church authorities, with the Freemasons being accused of worshipping the same demon as the Templars, the goat-headed Baphomet. On top of this, the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant churches had many complaints against the Freemasons, such as their ritual of swearing oaths to superiors outside the church. For many governments, this semi-secretive nature was also a sticking point, since every year more people in power professed to be Freemasons. Government regulation or outright bans began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as did papal condemnation of the organization. The most famous reaction against Masonry in the United States was the Morgan Affair in 1826. William Morgan, an anti-Mason publisher, disappeared, with Freemasonry being blamed for his death. The affair sparked the founding of the Anti-Masonic Party, one of America's first significant third parties, with membership by the likes of John Quincy Adams. Another extreme reaction to Freemasonry was an outright ban in Russia in 1822. Furthermore, the French Revolution is often blamed on the Freemasons in conspiracy circles, which is ironic because Freemasonry was also accused by French revolutionaries for being a haven for the bourgeoisie. Of course, no discussion of Freemasons is complete without discussing the Illuminati. Yeah, the Illuminati existed, and no, they were not Freemasons. The Illuminati were formed in 1776 in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt. The difference between the two groups is simple. The Illuminati were political radicalists, while the Freemasons were more or less apolitical. The Illuminati did use Freemason-like rituals and iconography, but they remained very distinct. The Illuminati's goals were to radically reform Central European society with Enlightenment ideals. Radicalism was the Illuminati's downfall, as the German-speaking states recognized them as a threat and suppressed them by 1787, but that did not stop the conspiracy theories. After the French Revolution, Scottish naturalist philosopher John Robinson and French Jesuit Augustin de Borel published similar theories concerning the French Revolution in 1789. Both claimed the Illuminati infiltrated the French Freemasons and caused the French Revolution. In the end, French Freemasonry would almost disappear under the Revolution until Napoleon Bonaparte revived it as an attempt at state religion. Another unfortunate elephant in the room is the connection between the Freemasons and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Originating from the fiercely anti-Masonic Tsarist regime in 1903, the Protocols are a hoax alleging a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. In the Protocols, Freemasonry is depicted as a tool of the so-called Jewish conspiracy. The irony of anti-Semitism and anti-Masonry is that many lodges did not allow Jewish initiates. Nevertheless, this anti-Semitic strain of anti-Masonry continues to this day among conspiracy theorists. This brings us around to the political slant. Although apolitical, charges of aiding colonialism are a common critique against the Freemasons. Whether this charge holds up completely is a complicated legacy, as some anti-colonial resistance movements were led by colonized Masons. For example, Emir Abdul Qadir, Algeria's national hero, became a Freemason during his exile in Syria. Reformers and resistance leaders associated with Egyptian independence, like Muhammad Abdu Jamal al-Din Afghani and Saad Zaghloul, are also Freemasons. There are lodges in Africa, the Middle East, and India founded during colonial expansion with native members. In the end, Freemasonry simply allowed people from different ethnicities and religions to congregate and work together. This allowed ideas of national independence to spread amongst like-minded colonized Freemasons, and political activities resulted. Continuing with the quasi-political slant, across the pond in America, Prince Hall Freemasonry refers to African-American lodges. Prince Hall was a black abolitionist who sought to become a Freemason and opened his own lodge for fellow black Freemasons, but this was rejected by white American lodges. He thus went outside of the United States to charter his lodge with the United Grand Lodge in London in 1784. On this note, tension between lodges of different ethnicities was known to be an issue in colonial times, such as that English Freemasons looked down on Irish lodges in America and Australia. Further, some lodges only allow Christians to be initiated. This brings us to the surviving Masonry split between the United Grand Lodge of England and Wales and the Grand Orient of France. Freemasonry has seen splits before, hence the inclusion of the word United in the United Grand Lodge, which formed in 1813. This particular split happens when the Grand Orient allowed the inclusion of atheists into Freemasonry in 1877. The United Grand Lodge allows anyone who professes faith in a Grand Architect to join, even encouraging the inclusion of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in India. This split is still maintained today, as one has to profess a belief in the Grand Architect of the universe to join a lodge under the United Grand Lodge of England and Wales. Another issue that separates the two is the inclusion of women. For the United Grand Lodge, no affiliation is given to mixed or female exclusive lodges. Ever rife for outside critique, many noted this stance didn't exactly live up to the Enlightenment ideals of egalitarianism held dear by the Freemasons. Eventually, the French Freemasons listened to such complaints, and now female lodges are generally accepted by the Grand Orient. Female lodges can range from having slightly different rituals than the male lodges to incorporating new rituals that tie the female initiate to biblical tales of Noah's daughters-in-law helping to build the ark, rather than the purely male association with Hiram. However, to this day, the United Grand Lodge still does not admit women or recognize female and mixed lodges. Regardless of English or French affiliation, all lodges operate very similarly. The lodges have masters and officers. They keep records of members and initiations and organize the running of the lodge and collect fees. The fees are used to run the lodge and put on events generally centered around helping the local community and charities, with some lodges emphasizing the charitable aspect more than others. They also use this money to put on cultural events for the public, such as operas and art shows. Lodges even hold concerts including modern genres like rock, pop, and rap. As for their scope, Grand Lodges oversee a territory that can encompass a country, or in the case of larger countries like the United States, a subset region. This all brings us around to inter-lodge relations, which, contrary to what you might expect from a supposedly unified, globally dominating secret society, are a complicated affair, as generally lodge members are encouraged not to visit other lodges, but it does happen. Beyond this, the Grand Lodge makes and enforces rules about these issues that are ignored or upheld depending on the individual lodge. As you might be gathering from all of this, in all, Freemasonry is somewhat decentralized. Irregular and quasi-Masonic lodges might be standalone without a governing body or have a separate governing body outside of the English and French lodges. In the end, a supposedly cohesive global secret society that isn't so secret is a strange contradiction, not to mention that, contrary to popular perception, their internal affairs are surprisingly decentralized and incohesive in many senses, making their supposed world domination and control even more suspect. But regardless, despite their best efforts to be transparent and their history of charitable causes and community-supporting events and deeds, conspiracy theories still inform the public discourse about the Freemasons. Reputable resources about Freemasonry are available, and the barrier of access is lower than you might think, but that's never stopped conspiracy theorists from ignoring such things and just coming up with whatever ideas in their head fit their worldview anyway. Here's to my sweet Satan. I sing because I live with Satan. He will give those with him 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer. Sad Satan. These are the disturbing words which appear when the 1971 Led Zeppelin masterpiece Stairway to Heaven is played in reverse, or so it's widely claimed. In the 1970s and 80s, a moral panic spread among American evangelical groups about rock bands hiding satanic and other subversive messages in their music. These messages, they claimed, were subliminally inserted by recording them backwards, a technique known as backmasking. This panic reached such hysterical heights that churches across the United States held record smashings and burnings. Several bands found themselves in court over corrupting lyrics, and the legend of backwards satanic messages became an indelible part of music culture. But did any artists actually hide backwards messages in their music? Well, yeah, but not for the reasons their evangelical critics believed. The practice of backmasking is as old as sound recording itself. Shortly after patenting the phonograph in 1877, Thomas Edison experimented with playing recorded music backwards, noting that the results sounded novel and sweet, but altogether different. The first association between backmasking and Satanism came in 1913, when British occultist Aleister Crowley, in his treatise Black Magic Book 4, recommended that those interested in black magic listen to phonographic records in reverse in order to learn how to think and speak backwards. Coincidentally, Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page would later purchase Crowley's former mansion, giving plenty of ammunition to the evangelical satanic panic crowd. Over the following decades, avant-garde composers like John Cage and Edgar Varese experimented with reversed recordings to create bold new soundscapes, a technique which was later adopted by various rock and roll groups starting in the 1960s, including the Beatles. According to John Lennon, after coming home from a party in 1966, he accidentally played a take of the song Rain backwards. Lennon, a fan of avant-garde music, was so enamored by the sound that he included a reversed version of the song's opening line in the fade-out. This is widely considered to be the first use of backmasking in a pop song. The technique was also heavily featured in the song Tomorrow Never Knows from the band's 1966 album Revolver, as well as throughout 1967's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Unfortunately for the Fab Four, this experimentation would lead to the first great backmasking controversy, as the technique formed a cornerstone of the infamous Paul is Dead urban legends. For the uninitiated, Paul is Dead was a popular conspiracy theory started in 1967, which held that Paul McCartney had in fact died in a car crash on November 9, 1966, and was subsequently replaced with an imposter. The theory further held that the remaining Beatles attempted to reveal Paul's fate by planting subtle cues in their songs and album covers. Among these supposed clues are the lyric "The Walrus Was Paul" from the 1968 song Glass Onion, and the cover of 1969's Abbey Road, on which Paul is barefoot and walking out of step with the rest of the band. But the most definitive clues, the theorists claimed, were revealed by playing Beatles records backwards, particularly the 1968 White Album. For example, Revolution 9 supposedly contains the message, "Turn me on, dead man, while I'm so tired," yields "Paul is dead, miss him, miss him." Of course, the entire Paul is Dead rumour is complete nonsense, and while the Beatles did pioneer the use of backmasking, none of the aforementioned examples were intentional uses of the technique. Rather, the supposed secret messages are merely cases of pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to perceive patterns in otherwise random data. Other famous examples of pareidolia include the face on the surface of Mars seen by the Viking 1 spacecraft in 1976, the face of the devil seen in the smoke billowing from the World Trade Center in 9/11, and the endless reports of Jesus and the Virgin Mary appearing on slices of toast and other objects. Research has also shown the strong influence of the observer expectancy effect, as few listeners will perceive the supposed hidden message unless they have already been primed to do so. Nonetheless, the fact that the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and other musicians did intentionally use backmasking for fun or artistic effect was enough to convince moral guardians that the techniques could also be used for nefarious purposes. The idea of backmasked satanic messages being intentionally hidden in rock music first emerged among American evangelical Christian groups in the late 1970s and early 1980s as part of a nationwide hysteria known as the Satanic Panic. The panic was kicked off by the 1972 publication of The Satan Seller by author Mike Walker, who claimed to have been inducted into and sexually abused by a satanic cult as a child. This was followed in 1980 by Michelle Remembers by Michelle Smith, who made similar accusations of ritual abuse. While both accounts were later exposed as frauds, they nonetheless birthed a widespread conspiracy theory that the Church of Satan and other occult groups were secretly controlling the government and the media by abducting or breeding thousands of children for use in orgies, human sacrifices, and other rituals. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, nearly 12,000 cases of satanic ritual abuse were reported nationwide, not one of which could be substantiated by the police. According to evangelical groups, the Church of Satan spread its influence by hiding subliminal messages in popular media, particularly rock music, long considered by Christian fundamentalists to be the devil's music. As claimed by evangelical figures like self-described neuroscientist William Yarrell, such messages could bypass conscious perception entirely, directly penetrating the unconscious mind, where they could be unknowingly accepted by the listener. Among the first to popularize this notion was Christian radio host Michael Mills, who in 1981 targeted the aforementioned Stairway to Heaven for its allegedly satanic content. Other leading evangelical pastors soon followed suit, including Paul Crouch, whose Trinity Broadcasting Network did much to spread the satanic panic. In 1982, Pastor Gary Greenwood began holding public lectures on the dangers of backmasking, while churches in North Carolina, Minnesota, and other states held public record smashings and burnings. The definitive authority on backmasking, however, was Jacob Ramser, whose 1983 book, Backward Masking Unmasked, claimed that effectively every rock song ever recorded contained some kind of hidden satanic message. The book was widely read in churches across the country as part of a crusade to stop the youth from listening to rock music. In addition to Led Zeppelin, Ramser's book accused dozens of other acts of hiding backmasked satanic messages in their music. One popular culprit was the Eagles' 1976 classic Hotel California, which, when played backward, allegedly reveals the message. Satan had him, he organized his own religion. Yeah, Satan hears this. he had me believe in him. Similarly, Cheap Trick's 1979 song Gonna Raise Hell yields the message Satan holds the keys to the lock. Styx's 1981 Snowblind, the words Satan moves through our voices, and the aptly titled Can't Get It Out of My Head from Electric Light Orchestra's 1974 album El Dorado, the slightly more cryptic Here's the Nasty One, Christ you're infernal, it is said we're dead men, everyone who has the mask will live. Not all backmask messages were in praise of the Prince of Darkness. For instance, Queen's 1980 hit, Another One Bites the Dust, allegedly conceals the message, it's fun to smoke marijuana. Other bands accused of hiding backmasked messages included Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Slayer, and Motorhead. Inevitably, many artists responded to these ludicrous allegations by deliberately hiding humorous messages in their songs. For example, the song Heavy Metal Poisoning from Styx's 1983 album Kilroy Was Here contains the backmasked Latin phrases Annuit Coptis and Novus Ordo Seclorum, translating as Providence favors our undertakings and New World Order. Both mottos have appeared on the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States in 1782 and are popularly associated with conspiracy theories involving the Freemasons and the Illuminati. More on the nose is ELO's 1975 song Fire on High, which when played backwards yields the words, the music is reversible, but time is not. Turn back, turn back, turn back, turn back. A similarly mocking message appears at the beginning of Pink Floyd's Empty Spaces from their 1980 album The Wall. Congratulations, you have just discovered the secret message. Please send your answer to Old Pink, care of the Funny Farm, Chalfont. The song I Remember Larry from Weird Al Yankovic's 1996 album Bad Hair Day contains the gem, wow, you must have an awful lot of free time on your hands. Yet, despite the absurd and baseless nature of the backmasking panic, it was taken seriously enough by the authorities that in 1990 the band Judas Priest found themselves in court over supposedly harmful subliminal messages in their music. On December 23, 1985, 18-year-old Raymond Belknap and 20-year-old James Vance of Reno, Nevada, ended a night of drinking, smoking marijuana, and listening to Judas Priest's album Stained Class by heading to a local playground and shooting themselves. Vance, who survived his suicide attempt, went on to claim that he and Belknap had been driven to kill themselves by lyrics such as Let's Be Dead and Do It in the song Better by You, Better Than Me. Earlier that year, a similar suit was filed against Ozzy Osbourne and CBS Records over Osbourne's song Suicide Solution, whose lyrics had allegedly driven 19-year-old California resident John Daniel McCullum to kill himself. But while that case was ultimately dismissed, absolving Osbourne of all responsibility for McCullum's death, Jerry Whitehead, the judge presiding over the Judas Priest lawsuit, ruled that subliminal messages did not count as speech and were thus not protected under the First Amendment. And so, 5 years after Belknap and Vance's attempted suicide, the case went to trial. Testifying in their own defense, the band attempted to demonstrate that any supposed subliminal messages in their work were completely accidental, with guitarist Glenn Tipton later recalling, "It's a fact that if you play speech backwards, some of it will seem to make sense. So I asked permission to go into a studio and find some perfectly innocent phonetic flukes. The lawyers didn't want to do it, but I insisted. We bought a copy of the Stained Class album in a local record shop, went into the studio, recorded it to tape, and turned it over and played it backwards. Right away we found Hey Ma, my chair's broken, and Give Me a Peppermint, and Help Me Keep a Job." Bill Kerbishley, Judas Priest's manager, also questioned what motivation the band could have for including harmful subliminal messages, stating, "If we were going to do that, I'd be saying, buy 7 copies, not telling a couple of screwed up kids to kill themselves." Meanwhile, the prosecution was firmly convinced that Judas Priest and other bands deliberately placed harmful messages in their music and that these messages were capable of subconsciously influencing the thoughts of vulnerable youths. As the attorney of the Belknap family stated during the trial, "I believe that alcohol and heavy metal music such as Judas Priest led us to be mesmerized. Judas Priest and CBS pander this stuff to alienated teenagers. The members of the chess club, the math and science majors don't listen to this stuff. It's the dropouts, the drug and alcohol abusers. So our argument is you have a duty to be more cautious when you're dealing with a population susceptible to this stuff." Much of the prosecution's case was based on the theories of David John Oates, who claims that when people speak, they subconsciously produce hidden backmasked messages that, when played in reverse, reveal their innermost thoughts. Oates' theories, however, have been roundly dismissed as pseudoscience, and none of the prosecution's expert witnesses were able to provide convincing evidence of the subliminal messaging and subconscious manipulation. Nonetheless, the bizarre trial dragged on for nearly a month, with singer Rob Halford later recalling, "We had to sit in this courtroom in Reno for 6 weeks. It was like Disney World. We had no idea what a subliminal message was. It was just a combination of some weird guitar sounds and the way I exhaled between lyrics. I had to sing Better by You, Better Than Me in court a cappella. I think that's when the judge thought, what am I doing here? No band goes out of its way to kill its fans." Indeed, Judge White had ultimately dismissed the case, ruling that the scientific research presented does not establish that subliminal stimuli, even if perceived, may precipitate conduct of this magnitude. The strongest evidence presented at this trial showed no behavioral effects other than anxiety, distress, or tension. But while this verdict was a victory for Judas Priest and musicians everywhere, it still left a dark cloud over the music industry, with Rob Halford lamenting, "It tore us up emotionally, hearing someone say to the judge and the cameras that this is a band that creates music that kills young people. We accept that some people don't like heavy metal, but we can't let them convince us that it's negative and destructive. Heavy metal is a friend that gives people great pleasure and enjoyment and helps them through hard times." In the advent of the compact disc and the increased difficulty of playing songs in reverse, it led to the decline of backmasking and the controversy surrounding the practice. Yet purported examples of hidden messages in music continue to pop up from time to time. For example, the 2019 Justin Bieber hit Baby allegedly contains the following message: "Acknowledge my Lord, Lord, he's here. I'm the evil one. Satanic new world, new world, new world. I want it, let me in, yay war, let me in, let me in, let me in, yay war." While playing Beyoncé's 2008 song Sweet Dreams backwards, purportedly reveals, "Hail Satan, hail Satan. I am worthy, I am worthy. Satan, I am sorry for the end of your sins, because they're going to live in hell, because they're going to live in hell. Hail Satan, I am worthy, I am worthy. I follow Lucifer. Hail Satan, because they're going to live in hell. I follow Lucifer." But just like in the 1970s and 1980s, these supposedly satanic rants are nothing more than strange coincidences, and in some cases a lot of generous interpretation of what one is hearing. Or as recent research has revealed, it is nearly impossible to write lyrics which are comprehensible when played both backwards and forwards, except by complete accident or through laborious trial and error, nor is there any evidence that such reverse messages can be consciously or unconsciously understood, let alone influence the listener's behavior. In the end, backmasking remains, what it has always been, a mere case of pareidolia, hearing what we want to hear. But if at this point you're still convinced that hidden nefarious messages are everywhere, then all I can say is this.
Area 51 is now so ingrained into popular culture that it's virtually synonymous with aliens. It's impossible to mention one without the other somehow creeping into the conversation. But why are the two so intrinsically linked? Why do we automatically picture little green men anytime someone so much as mentions the words Area 51? First, it's important to realize what Area 51 actually is. For all intents and purposes, and according to every government document ever released, Area 51 is a secret military base where they test experimental pieces of military hardware. For example, experimental jets such as the SR-71 Blackbird and the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady were tested at the Area 51 base. The latter of which was actually the first piece of hardware publicly known to have been constructed and tested there. The site Area 51 was built on was supposedly first chosen due to the incredibly smooth land found on nearby lake beds, coupled with the area's natural inaccessibility. Both of these features made it perfect for testing aircraft like the Lockheed U-2, which required a large area of flat land from which it could take off and land, while at the same time required being in an area enemies of the US couldn't, at the time, easily lay their peepers on.
Understandably, for a location that deals in incredibly sensitive military information that costs billions to produce, the government has a real hard-on for keeping it secret. However, over the years, this hasn't exactly panned out. For example, on April the 19th, 1974, astronauts taking part in a Skylab mission accidentally photographed the airfield at Groom Lake. Groom Lake is an alternative name for Area 51. The funny part of this is that the photo wasn't taken by the ship the astronauts were on. It was taken by one of the astronauts when he pointed his camera out of the window. This is despite the fact that said astronaut was under specific instructions not to take pictures of that particular area of Earth. It's not currently known whether or not this event was a mistake by the astronaut or a conscious decision on his behalf. The first known picture of the site to eke its way into the public domain was taken in 1968 during a US geological survey. However, as far back as 1955, papers have made passing reference to the facility, referring to it as a super-secret Atomic Energy Commission installation. They obviously sucked at naming things back then. Though the government has always maintained a rather tight-lipped stance on the base, slip-ups have been made in the past. For example, there is a document where Area 51 is referred to by name by the then CIA director Richard Helms in a secret memo discussing air reconnaissance of North Vietnam in 1967. However, for the most part, the government has always either remained coy or simply ignored the site altogether when referring to it in official documentation. As for what it's actually like to work at Area 51, unlike pop culture would have you believe, the people who worked there aren't forbidden from ever speaking to their family or held in giant underground bunkers a la Independence Day. Just ask James Noyce, who worked in the secret facility for decades. Though James has been sworn to secrecy, as to be expected when you work on highly experimental, classified government projects, he's free to talk about his experiences there. For example, James noted that he was always paid in cash, whereas others were paid in checks from companies they didn't work for. Even more interesting, when a plane from Area 51 crashed once, James was tasked with confiscating the cameras of a nearby family, who were quickly rewarded with a fat stack of cash for their silence.
So why do we think aliens are stored there?
Although the testimonials of people like James, trusted government and military officials with decades of experience, do include a number of telling facts about Area 51, he and the other people who've spoken out about it have never once alluded to any sort of alien activity ever occurring there. But of course the government would say that governments lie all the time about stuff like this. So what about Roswell? Surely that's where all the rumors started, right? Well, not so much. Though today some conspiracy theorists believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell was of alien origin and that it was or is now being stored in Area 51, when the incident first took place, Area 51 wasn't mentioned in any documentation from that time. Not to mention the fact that the two sites are hundreds of miles apart. If the wreckage was of alien origin and it was moved, it's likely the government would have moved it somewhere closer. Though the Roswell Daily Record from the 6th of July 1947 did feature the words "flying saucer" on its front page, secret government facilities, and in particular Area 51, were not mentioned. It would be another 20 years before Area 51 was even referred to in an official sense. People back then had no idea it even existed, meaning that they'd have been unable to suggest that the wreckage could have been taken there, even if they did believe it was of extraterrestrial origin. In fact, it would appear that the stories about aliens being held in Area 51 are a rather recent invention. It wasn't until 1989 when the awesomely named Robert Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas TV station under the guise of a government scientist and stated that Area 51 was just full of alien technology that interest in Area 51 and aliens really started to gain momentum. We should mention that almost as soon as Lazar appeared on TV, every single one of his credentials was pulled to pieces. No school he claimed to attend had ever heard of him, and the science behind his theories was soundly debunked. However, the very first known mention of Area 51 on TV was a full year earlier in 1968 during the show UFO Cover-Up Live, which oddly enough revolved around the possibility of the existence of UFOs being covered up. Just to clarify, Roswell, UFOs, aliens, little green men in Area 51 were in no way linked as far as popular public opinion was concerned, until exactly one man went on TV and claimed that that was the case. Go science!